What's up, guys? Welcome to Watch Harry. We've got something special today. Madame Pomfrey's mandatory first-year scan found 64 healing charms hiding years of Dursley abuse from everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, 64. The Hogwarts Express pulled into Hogsmeade Station at exactly 3 minutes past 6, and Harry Potter stepped onto the platform with 11 years of careful habits written into every movement he made. He didn't jostle for position at the carriage doors. He waited until the rush thinned, then moved through the gap with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned early that drawing attention was dangerous and taking up space was a luxury other people had. He kept his trunk close. He watched the platform the way you watch a room when you're not sure who in it might turn hostile, not with fear, exactly, but with the steady, low-level alertness that had kept him functioning through a decade of Privet Drive. The night was cool and smelled like rain and pine and something older underneath both, something earthy and electric that Harry had no name for but felt in the back of his teeth. Lanterns bobbed ahead through the dark. A voice like a foghorn cut through the noise of 100 first years stumbling off a train. Furs years. Furs years over here. Harry found the voice attached to a man who was, in the simplest possible terms, the largest human being he had ever seen. Hagrid, he'd been told on the platform at King's Cross, though at the time he'd been mostly focused on finding the right platform and not losing his owl. The man stood a full head and shoulders above the tallest adult nearby, a lantern the size of a bucket swinging from one fist, a beard that could have housed several families of birds. Harry moved toward him without hesitation. He'd already made 2 calculations. The man was clearly expected and official, and his eyes, deep-set and dark, were kind in the way eyes are kind when it's not an act. The boats were something Harry hadn't anticipated. He settled into one with a red-haired boy he'd met briefly on the train, Ron, who talked about Quidditch with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up surrounded by people who let him be enthusiastic about things, and a girl with a lot of bushy hair who had introduced herself in the train corridor and then proceeded to demonstrate that she had already memorized most of their first-year curriculum. Hermione. She sat across from Harry now, taking in the approaching castle with an expression that looked like someone who had been promised something extraordinary and was watching that promise being kept. Harry looked at Hogwarts and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't have language for yet. It was enormous. It was lit from what seemed like every window, towers climbing into the dark like they were trying to reach something. The lake reflected it back so that there were 2 castles, one solid and one shivering in the black water, and the one in the water looked like it was alive in a way the stone one didn't, or maybe they were both alive and that was the point. Harry had spent his whole life being told magic wasn't real. His whole life watching a world go on around him that felt wrong in a way he couldn't name, like wearing someone else's shoes. He looked at Hogwarts and something inside him, something that had been held very still for a very long time, exhaled. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Ron, beside him, breathed out a low whistle. "Wicked," he said, with the tone of someone for whom this was the highest possible compliment. Harry found, for the first time he could remember, that he entirely agreed with someone. The sorting was less frightening than Harry had expected and more interesting. A hat sang a song about the qualities of each house: Gryffindor's courage, Ravenclaw's wisdom, Hufflepuff's loyalty, Slytherin's ambition, and Harry listened to all of it with genuine attention because he had learned that information, any information, was worth having. When his name was called and he settled the hat onto his head, he was expecting silence. What he got was a voice. "Interesting," it said. "Very interesting. 10 years of that and you're still, well. There's bravery here, certainly. But it's not the loudest thing, is it? There's something sharper underneath. A mind that doesn't stop. Cunning, too, though you won't thank me for saying it." Harry thought, with some precision, "I don't actually care which house you put me in. I care about not being sent back to Privet Drive. Those are the only 2 things I care about right now." The hat seemed to find this amusing. "Honest. That's rarer than you'd think. Well then. You'd do well in any house, but I think, yes. You know what you need? You need people who will be loyal to you. And you need somewhere that will fight for you when the time comes. Better be, Gryffindor. Harry handed the hat back to Professor McGonagall, who was watching him with an expression he catalogued as something like assessing, and walked to the Gryffindor table where Ron Weasley was already cheering and someone further down was shouting, "We got Potter," as though Harry were a prize that had been awarded. He sat down. He kept his face pleasant and neutral because pleasant and neutral was safe, and he listened to the rest of the sorting with one part of his attention while the other part noted exit locations and the faces of the teachers at the high table and what each of them seemed to be. Dumbledore he looked at last. The headmaster was elderly and beaming and had the kind of face that made most people stop thinking critically. Harry kept thinking critically. He noted the way Dumbledore's gaze moved to him briefly with something that was too controlled to be casual. He filed this away. He ate his dinner. He ate more of it than he would normally have allowed himself to, because there was a voice somewhere in the back of his skull, the same voice that had kept him alive for 10 years, that said eat when there is food and sleep when there is safety, and he was working on the theory that Hogwarts might be both. He ate roast chicken and mashed potato and peas and then a slice of treacle tart, and Ron watched him with a grin. "You eat like my brothers," Ron said. "That's a compliment. My brothers eat like they're in a race." "I was hungry," Harry said, which was the simple truth. "You missed the dessert course on the train, didn't you? I saw you didn't get a trolley thing." Harry had not bought from the trolley because he had a limited amount of money and no idea what anything cost in this world yet, and the arithmetic of scarcity was something he applied automatically to everything. But he just said, "I'm making up for it now," and Ron laughed and offered him another piece of tart. It was, Harry thought, a strange and not unpleasant feeling, having someone offer him food without it being a punishment or a trap. The next morning was September 2nd, and at 9:30, every first year in Gryffindor received a folded piece of parchment from an owl that deposited it with mild attitude and then left before anyone could ask questions. Harry opened his and read, "All first-year students are required to report to the hospital wing this morning at the time indicated below for a mandatory health screening. This is a new requirement enacted by the Hogwarts Board of Governors and applies to all incoming students. Please bring nothing. The examination is brief. Your appointment, 9:45 a.m. Poppy Pomfrey." Matron Harry read it twice, then folded it and put it in his pocket. "What's a health screening?" Ron asked, holding his own letter at arm's length as though it might do something. "She's going to check we're healthy," Hermione said, from across the common room. She was dressed already, a book open on the arm of her chair, and she sounded as though she'd already processed the letter and moved on. "It makes sense. We're children coming from all sorts of different backgrounds. Some of us might have underlying conditions that could affect our magic development or our safety at school. It's actually quite responsible. My mum does a health check on us before every school year," Ron said. "Just wave of a wand kind of thing. Is that what this is?" "Something like that, presumably." Harry said nothing. He refolded the letter one more time, very neatly, and watched the fire. He had learned, over the years, to maintain a functional exterior without much effort. He could feel his pulse doing something he didn't like, a little too fast, a little too high, and he breathed through it methodically. A health check. He thought about what a health check might find. He thought about 64 separate occasions on which someone in this world had cast a healing charm on him, each one a small invisible scar in his magical signature, and he thought about what that looked like to a trained medical professional with the right diagnostic tools. He had known, in some theoretical sense, that this was information that existed. He had never much thought about what happened if someone found it. He stood up, straightened his robes, and went to find the hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey was a trim, brisk woman with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that said she had been doing this job for long enough that nothing surprised her anymore. She had a manner about her that Harry recognized immediately, the manner of someone for whom efficiency was a form of compassion, who showed care through competence rather than softness. He had met exactly 2 adults in his life who operated that way. He liked her immediately and with complete wariness. The hospital wing was large and airy, beds lined along both walls, the late morning light coming in through high windows. 3 other first years were ahead of Harry, 2 Gryffindors whose names he hadn't caught yet, and a small Hufflepuff girl with plates who looked mildly nervous. Pomfrey moved through them efficiently. A sweep of the wand, a murmured diagnostic charm, a check of the readout that appeared briefly in the air in gold script. 2 minutes each. She made small notes on a clipboard and sent them off with brief, practical reassurances. Harry watched the diagnostic charm land on the Hufflepuff girl and spread like light through water, gentle and thorough. He watched it resolve into a short paragraph of text in the air above her head. He watched Pomfrey read it, nod, and note something down. He calculated how long he had. "Potter," Pomfrey said, not unkindly. "You're next." Harry stepped forward and stood at the foot of the empty examination bed. He noted distantly, not going to lie down unless asked. He preferred to be standing. He had always preferred to be in a position where he could move quickly. Pomfrey looked at him with the brisk, assessing look of someone doing a job. "This is a standard diagnostic charm," she said. "You'll feel nothing. It simply takes stock of your general health, any existing conditions, previous magical treatments, that sort of thing. It takes about 30 seconds. Any questions?" "No," Harry said. She raised her wand. Corpore Revela. The charm was a warm wash of gold, exactly as he'd observed, spreading from his head to his feet in a slow, methodical wave. Harry stood completely still. He was very good at standing still. He had spent years being very still in very small spaces. The charm resolved. The diagnostic text appeared in the air above him. Pomfrey read the first 3 lines and went very quiet. Harry watched her face. He was very good at reading faces. He saw the moment her professional composure did something unexpected, not shattered, exactly, but shifted, like a wall that had received a weight it wasn't built for. She read on. Her jaw tightened. Something moved through her eyes that was not pity, which Harry appreciated, but was something hotter and more complicated than pity. She read to the end. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Harry counted them. "Potter," she said, and her voice was doing something careful and controlled, "I'm going to ask you to sit on the bed, please." "How many?" Harry said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "How many results did it find?" He kept his voice even. Matter of fact. He was asking a practical question and he wanted a practical answer. Pomfrey held his gaze for a long moment. He got the impression she was taking his measure in some way, deciding something. Then she said, very quietly, 64. Harry nodded. He had known the number would be high. He had not expected to feel quite so calm when he heard it, but he was calm, and the calm was real, and it was the particular calm of someone who has already processed the worst of a thing in real time and is now simply dealing with its consequences. He sat on the bed because she'd asked him to, not because he needed to. 64 recorded instances of magical healing, Pomfrey continued, and she was watching him with an intensity that was not unkind. Some of them very recent. Some going back, she stopped. Started again. Some of them going back approximately 8 years. 3, Harry said. I'm sorry. I was 3. The first one. He wasn't sure why he said it. Perhaps because accuracy felt important. I broke 2 ribs. My aunt did something with a wand, I didn't know what it was at the time, I didn't know about magic. She healed the bones. But not completely. She only healed them enough that I could move properly. Pomfrey's hand, the one holding the clipboard, tightened fractionally. She did a partial healing, she said, with a flatness that was covering something else entirely. I think she didn't want a Muggle doctor to see them, Harry said. He'd worked this out years later and had found it more interesting than upsetting, the way you find the mechanics of something interesting once you're safely past it. Broken ribs in a 3-year-old would have been, she'd have had to explain them. Yes, Pomfrey said. She would have. She set the clipboard down on the small table beside the bed and looked at him directly. Harry. I need you to understand that what I'm looking at here, this diagnostic result, this isn't something I can simply note and move on from. What you're describing, and what this scan has documented, is, I know what it is, Harry said. Not rudely. Simply. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. She seemed to understand, and she seemed to decide something, and when she spoke again her voice had shifted into something more level, something that was treating him like a person capable of handling information rather than a child who needed to be protected from it. I'm going to need to contact the headmaster, she said. And I'm going to need to run a full secondary scan, a deeper one, that documents each instance individually. It will take about 20 minutes and it will be entirely painless. And I need you to understand that this is not about getting you in trouble or causing you distress. This is me doing my job properly. Do you understand? Yes, Harry said. I'm also going to need to ask you some questions. I know. Are you all right? It was such a direct question. Such a plain, simple question, asked in a voice that wasn't performing concern but actually wanted to know. Harry considered it with genuine attention, the way he considered everything. I'm fine, he said. Then, because it was her and she'd been straight with him, I've been fine for a while. The last time anything, he paused. Nothing has happened this summer. They mostly ignore me now. I think they were frightened of the letter. The Hogwarts letter. Your relatives were frightened of the letter? 11 letters, Harry said. Then Hagrid came. Yes. They were very frightened. They were frightened of me, a bit, I think. By the end. He said this without satisfaction and without regret. Just observation. Pomfrey was quiet for a moment. Then she said, right. I'm going to start the secondary scan. You sit still. And if anything I do makes you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately and I'll stop. Yes? Harry nodded. No one had ever told him that before, that he could say stop and it would be respected. He noted it. He did not respond to it visibly. She raised her wand again and he sat still, and she worked. The 20 minutes of the secondary scan became 40, and then the door to the hospital wing opened and Albus Dumbledore walked in at a speed that was more urgent than his usual measured pace. He had clearly come from wherever he'd been summoned from quickly, because his robes were slightly less settled than Harry assumed they normally were, and he was not currently emanating the particular atmosphere of serene control that Harry had noticed at dinner last night. Pomfrey had sent a Patronus. Harry had watched a silver cat pad out of the room 15 minutes into the scan and felt a certain inevitability about what would follow. Dumbledore stopped when he saw Harry sitting calmly on the examination bed, the secondary diagnostic still running, golden notation writing itself in the air beside him in 2 neat columns. He looked at the columns. He looked at them for a long time. Harry, he said, and his voice was, Harry filed through his mental catalogue, controlled, but not comfortably controlled. Controlled the way a man is controlled when he is preventing himself from showing something large. Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at Pomfrey. Pomfrey looked at Dumbledore with an expression that Harry, from his position on the bed between them, could see clearly and which could be described most simply as, do not. Poppy, 64, Albus, she said quietly. I saw. The earliest goes back 8 years. He was 3 years old. I know. Then you understand, she said, and her voice was perfectly controlled and absolutely furious, that this requires more than a conversation. The two of them were having a second conversation underneath the spoken one, the kind that people who have worked together for decades have in abbreviated shorthand. Harry watched both conversations with interest. Yes, Dumbledore said. He moved to a chair and sat down, which Harry hadn't expected. It made him seem less like an authority and more like a person, and Harry adjusted his read of him accordingly, not a man performing composure, but a man who had just had something shift under him and was sitting down because standing felt wrong. Harry. I owe you an explanation. Several, Harry said pleasantly. Dumbledore looked at him with something Harry couldn't quite catalogue. It wasn't surprise, exactly. It was the look of someone who has built a model of a situation in their head and is watching the actual situation decline to match it. Yes, Dumbledore said. Several. You are not quite what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more, he stopped. Reconsidered. In a different way, Harry thought, than adults usually stopped and reconsidered. This was a man who was genuinely redirecting, not performing honesty. I expected more visible distress. Oh, Harry said. I processed most of this a long time ago. He looked at the golden notation floating in the air beside him, 64 items listed in careful sequence, date estimates and severity ratings and the particular shape of each imperfect healing. Can I have a copy of that? He asked Pomfrey. She blinked. Yes. Yes, of course you can. Thank you. He looked back at Dumbledore. Who else needs to be told? Dumbledore seemed to understand that he was being offered a specific kind of conversation and that Harry had chosen the terms of it deliberately. The Board of Governors, he said carefully. The Department of Magical Child Welfare. And in all likelihood, the Wisengamot. What happens to my aunt and uncle? That will depend on the legal proceedings. And what happens to me? A pause. What do you mean? Harry kept his voice even and his eyes steady. I mean, where do I go? Not back to Privet Drive. I am telling you now, clearly and on record with Madame Pomfrey present, that I will not go back to Privet Drive. I want to know what the alternative is. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and Harry looked back, and neither of them blinked, and the silence was the kind that has weight. You won't need to go back to Privet Drive, Dumbledore said. I want that in writing. Another pause. Something shifted in Dumbledore's face, and Harry thought it might be respect, which was interesting, because he hadn't been trying to earn it. He'd just been asking for what was reasonable. You'll have it in writing, Dumbledore said. Thank you. Pomfrey made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and turned back to her diagnostic equipment with great focus. By noon, the Gryffindor common room knew something had happened with the health screenings, because Harry had been gone since 9:45 and it was now the lunch hour and he still hadn't appeared. Hermione knew this because she had been counting and cataloguing, and she knew it in the way she knew most things, with complete certainty and moderate anxiety about what it meant. He's probably fine, Ron said, around a mouthful of sandwich. Probably just took longer for some reason. It was supposed to be 10 minutes. Maximum. Maybe he's got some weird magical condition. Some people do. My cousin Amos had this thing with his magical core that made all his charms come out backwards, and, that's not a documented condition, Ron. Tell that to Amos, every time he tried to Wingardium Leviosa something and it went through the floor instead. Ron took another bite. Point is, Harry's probably fine. Harry appeared at the entrance to the Great Hall at 12:15, which Hermione observed from her position at the Gryffindor table with relief so acute it was annoying. He walked in, took a seat, and began filling his plate with the unhurried competence of someone who had decided they were hungry and was doing something about it. He looked exactly the same as he always looked. That was, Hermione thought, either very reassuring or very concerning. She moved down the bench. Are you all right? Yes, Harry said. You were gone for, it was a very long time. They ran a secondary scan. It took longer. He speared a piece of chicken. I'll tell you later. It's fine. I'm fine. Hermione studied his face. He was telling the truth about the fine part, or at least, the version of fine that Harry Potter operated with, which she was already beginning to understand was a broader category than most people's. He was eating. He was calm. His eyes were doing the thing they sometimes did where they looked older than 11, but that was not new. She went back to her seat and let him eat. Ron asked him how it had gone, and Harry said the screening had flagged a few things that needed looking into, nothing alarming, just administrative, and Ron said, "Oh, right," and moved on to talking about Quidditch tryouts, which apparently happened soon, and Harry listened with genuine interest and asked a question about the snitch that sent Ron into a detailed explanation that lasted through most of the main course. He didn't tell them what the scan had found. Not yet. Hermione could see the decision in the set of his shoulders. He knew he was going to tell them, he'd already calculated the when and how, and it wasn't now. She was 11 years old and she was already learning things from Harry Potter that no book had taught her. The afternoon was free of classes, schedules to be collected but lessons not yet begun, and Harry spent it in two places. The first was the library, where he found a section on magical law and pulled 3 books, one on the Wisengamot's child welfare statutes, one on guardianship law in magical Britain, and one general overview of the British magical legal system, and read them with the focus of someone who has identified a problem and is gathering the tools to solve it. He read quickly and retained well, always had, despite the best efforts of Dudley's school to make him pretend otherwise. He took notes in the margins of a piece of parchment, small and precise. The second place was the Owlery, where he sat for a while with his owl, Hedwig. He'd named her on the train and it had felt right immediately, the way few things felt right immediately, and she clicked her beak at him and regarded him with amber eyes that were entirely too intelligent for comfort and completely unconcerning because of it. He had made, in the hospital wing this morning, a series of decisions. Not dramatic ones. Not the kind that felt large in the moment. The quiet kind, the kind that settle into place like pieces of a structure, load-bearing and certain. He was not going back to the Dursleys. He was going to pursue whatever legal process was available to him to make that permanent and properly documented, because verbal assurances from even very powerful men had a history of not being enough. He was going to be honest about what had happened, because the diagnostic scan had made dishonesty moot and because he'd found, in the past several months since he discovered he was a wizard, that the truth was generally more useful than the alternative. And he was going to continue being himself, which meant continuing to assess situations carefully, to gather information, to treat adults with respect that was conditional on their earning it, and to not be afraid of anything that didn't genuinely warrant fear. The Dursleys had been frightening for about 5 years, between the ages of 3 and 8. After that, they'd become complicated. Unpleasant. A variable to be managed. He had managed them for 3 years. He had managed 11 letters and 1 very large groundskeeper and a Wizarding World landing without warning in the middle of his life, and he was here now, in a castle that felt like it had been waiting for him, with an owl that trusted him and 2 people at lunch who'd both moved closer when he came back rather than away. He was 11 years old and he was fine, and he knew the word fine was doing heavy lifting, but for now it was accurate enough. He was fine. Hedwig bumped her head against his hand and he stroked her feathers and watched the sun going down behind the mountains and let himself, very briefly, just be somewhere. That evening, in the Gryffindor common room after dinner, Harry told Ron and Hermione what the scan had found. He chose his moment. The common room was thinning out, the hour was late enough that the nearby clusters of students were absorbed in their own conversations, and both Ron and Hermione were across the table from him, working on their first piece of Transfiguration homework. He waited until there was a natural pause, and then he said, quietly, "I want to tell you what happened this morning. Both of you." They both looked up. He told them. He told them the way he told himself things, factually, without embellishment, with the relevant details placed in order. He told them about the healing charms, all 64 of them, about Pomfrey's face when she'd read the diagnostic, about Dumbledore sitting down unexpectedly. He told them about Privet Drive in the same tone, the cupboard under the stairs, Ron's jaw tightened when he said cupboard, and Harry noted it, the years of systematic neglect, the specific occasions that had required magical healing. He didn't do it to make them feel a particular way. He did it because they were going to be his friends. He had already decided this, with the same quiet certainty he decided most things, and he didn't want to build a friendship on incomplete information. When he finished, Hermione was very still in the way she went still when she was processing something large and had not yet decided what to do with it. Ron was staring at the table. "Harry," Ron said. He stopped. Started again. That's really bad." "Yes," Harry said. How are you?" "I'm all right," Harry said. "I want you to know that I mean that. I'm not performing it. I know it sounds like something you say, but I've had 10 years to. It's not new information, for me. It's just new information for everyone else." Ron looked at him with his freckled face doing something complicated. Then he said, "Right. Okay. So, what do we do?" It was, Harry thought, the exact right question. Not how do you feel or are you sure you're okay or any of the other questions that made him feel like a problem to be solved. What do we do? Present tense, first person plural. We. There will be a legal proceeding, Harry said. Weisengamat. I'm going to need to be prepared for it. He looked at Hermione. Hermione had been waiting, apparently, for a signal that action was appropriate rather than comfort, because she sat up immediately. "I started looking at guardianship law this afternoon," she said. "I was in the library." "So was I," Harry said. She blinked. Then, despite everything, she smiled. "What sections?" 42 through 60 of the Wizarding Child Welfare Act, the section on contested guardianship, and the precedents for removal from Muggle custody in the Magical Authority of Minors Handbook. Hermione stared at him. Those are the right sections. I know. I read those too and I thought she stopped. We should compare notes. That's what I was hoping, Harry said. Ron looked between them with an expression that suggested he was watching something either very impressive or very alarming and hadn't decided which. I'll be here, he said. To help. With, whatever the non-library parts are. The non-library parts will need you, Harry said seriously. Ron straightened slightly. Yeah. Right. Obviously. The fire crackled. Somewhere above them, the castle settled in the particular way old buildings settle at night, a deep sound like breathing. The three of them pulled their parchment closer and got to work, and the common room emptied around them, and the night went on, and for the first time in a very long time Harry Potter sat in a warm room doing something that mattered with people who had chosen to stay, and he let that be something. He let that be something. At 11:15, after Ron had fallen asleep face down on his Transfiguration homework and Hermione had gone upstairs with a stack of notes and a focused expression, Harry sat alone by the fire for a while. He thought about 64. Not about what each one meant, or the specific weight of it. He'd done that thinking over years. He thought about the number itself, the strange weight of it as a public fact now, a diagnostic result floating in golden text, documented and witnessed. It had existed before, but it had existed as something that was his experience, his secret, his arithmetic. Now it was also evidence. Now it was a record. Now it was something other people could hold. He wasn't sure how he felt about that yet. He thought about Pomfrey's face, that particular expression, not pity, something hotter, and he thought about Dumbledore sitting down, and he thought about Ron saying what do we do and Hermione already being in the same section of the library and his owl bumping her head against his hand in the Ollery. He thought about the parchment in his pocket, the one Pomfrey had printed for him, 64 entries in careful sequence, documentation of every time someone had caught what was being done to him and repaired it just enough and then turned away. He was going to use it. Every entry. He was going to walk into the Wisengamot with that parchment and with Hermione's legal research and with his own carefully constructed arguments, and he was going to be impossible to dismiss, because he had spent 10 years being dismissible, small, strange, the unwanted nephew, the boy in the cupboard, and he understood, with a clarity that felt new, that he did not have to be that anymore. He wasn't frightened. He was, if anything, interested. He banked the fire, as he'd been doing for years in the Dursley kitchen, the motion automatic and neat, and he climbed the stairs to the dormitory and got into his bed, and it was the softest surface he had ever slept on in his life, and he was asleep in 4 minutes. Outside, Hogwarts settled around him. The portraits murmured. The staircases shifted. The great castle breathed. Harry Potter slept without one ear open. For the first time in 10 years, he did not have to listen for anything. Chapter 2, The Shape of a Secret. The thing about secrets at Hogwarts was that the castle itself didn't keep them. The portraits talked. The ghosts drifted through walls at inconvenient moments. The staircases led you past conversations you weren't meant to hear, and the enchanted ceilings and murmuring suits of armor created an ecosystem of information that moved the way water moves, finding every crack, filling every low place. By breakfast on the 3rd of September, something was circulating. Harry could feel it the moment he walked into the Great Hall, that particular shift in ambient noise, the way a room full of people sounds different when a significant portion of them are talking about the same thing. Not loud. The opposite of loud. The specific quiet of people speaking carefully. He got porridge and toast and sat down and poured himself tea and said nothing. Ron dropped into the seat beside him. "People are talking," he said, with the direct simplicity Harry was coming to appreciate as Ron's defining characteristic. "I noticed. About the health screenings. Someone, I don't know who, maybe someone who had their appointment after you and overheard something. There's a story going around that Madame Pomfrey found something serious in one of the first years. Nobody's using names yet." "Yet," Harry said. "Yet," Ron agreed. Hermione sat down across from them, already organized, books stacked, notes folded into her Transfiguration text, reading the Daily Prophet that had arrived with the morning owls. She looked up briefly. "Percy says the teachers have been having conversations this morning. He didn't know what about, but he said McGonagall cancelled her pre-breakfast office hours, which apparently she never does." "Percy's your brother?" Harry asked Ron. "Third one. He's a prefect. He notices things like McGonagall's office hours because he's Percy." Ron said this with the exact tone of someone describing a natural phenomenon, not unkind, just accurate. Harry ate his porridge. Around him the Great Hall moved through its morning rituals, owls dropping mail, students arguing over schedules, the smell of bacon and parchment and the faint electric smell of ambient magic that he was already starting to identify as simply the smell of Hogwarts. He watched the staff table without appearing to. Dumbledore was absent. McGonagall was present, but her attention kept pulling toward the door with the careful inattention of someone waiting for something. Professor Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, was eating toast and looking slightly unfocused, which seemed to be his general setting. Snape was drinking tea and looking at nothing with the particular expression of a man attending a meeting he found beneath him. Several other teachers Harry hadn't yet identified were doing their morning things. He noted the absence of Dumbledore. He noted McGonagall's tension. He catalogued these things alongside the murmuring in the hall and returned to his porridge. His name hadn't surfaced yet. When it did, and it would change something about how this year went. He was thinking about that, about the shape of the change, about how to be ready for it without preparing for the wrong version of it. Hermione folded down the Prophet. "There's nothing in here about it. Whatever it is. It's too soon," Harry said. "It only happened yesterday." She looked at him. He looked back. She'd been doing this since last night, these little checks, discreet glances that asked "Are you actually all right?" without making him answer it out loud. He found it tolerable, which surprised him. He found most expressions of concern intolerable in the automatic, reflexive way of someone who has learned that concern is usually either pity or prelude. Hermione's version wasn't either. It was just her paying attention, because she paid attention to everything. He gave her a small nod that said yes, and she returned to her notes. Ron, beside him, had moved on to reading the Quidditch scores from the back of the Prophet without any of this happening, and Harry thought that was also, in its way, exactly right. The morning's lessons were a staggered introduction. Half the first-year timetable was in place and the other half would begin the following day. Gryffindors had Transfiguration first, which meant Professor McGonagall, who walked into the classroom looking entirely herself in every way that wasn't her eyes. Her eyes were doing what Harry had noticed at breakfast, a controlled quality, watchful, like someone with something sitting heavily behind them. She transformed a desk into a pig and back again with the precise efficiency of a woman who has made the same demonstration for 30 years and finds it no less useful for that, and then she set them to turning a match into a needle, and she walked the room. When she reached Harry's desk, she paused a half-second longer than at anyone else's. He held the match in 2 fingers and he was very deliberately not transformed it yet, examining the grain of the wood. "Potter," she said quietly, under the general noise of other students attempting the charm. "I'd like a word after class." "Of course, Professor," Harry said. She moved on. He turned the match into a needle, not just turned the shape but got the silver color and the slight flecks of real steel, and set it down on the desk and went back to examining it. Hermione, 3 desks away, had also produced a needle and was frowning at it because the tip wasn't quite sharp enough. Harry watched her adjust her wand movement and get it right and felt a stab of something that was almost competitive, which was unfamiliar enough that he noticed it. He'd never had anyone to be competitive with before. Dudley had always made sure Harry failed at school long before the grades came in. He let himself be a little pleased about the needle. He thought that might be all right. After class, while the other Gryffindors filed out discussing transfiguration theory at the volume of people who have just been told something is hard and find it exciting, Harry waited. McGonagall was tidying her desk with slightly more organization than necessary, the action of someone using a familiar task to settle themselves. He sat on the edge of his chair and was quiet. She sat down across from him eventually and looked at him with those controlled eyes that were currently doing something he catalogued as carefully restrained distress. "I won't ask you how you are," she said, which immediately distinguished her from the 7 people who had asked him that since this morning. "I imagine you've had quite enough of that question." "Some," Harry said. "I wanted to tell you," she stopped. The precision he'd observed in her teaching was present here too, but it was working harder. "I've known you were living with your aunt for 10 years. I visited your relatives once, when you were very young. I had reservations. I expressed them to Dumbledore at the time." Harry waited. "He told me the blood protection was essential. That it was the only thing that would keep you safe from Voldemort's remaining supporters. That it required the placement and could not be changed." Her jaw tightened very slightly. "I accepted that. I want you to know that I accepted it without sufficient pressure, and that I am not comfortable with that now." "Okay," Harry said. She looked at him. "That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I'd like you to tell me I should have pushed harder. Or tell me it isn't my fault. Or something." "I don't know if it's your fault," Harry said honestly. "I don't know enough about what you knew and when. And I don't particularly want to spend time assigning blame to people who weren't the ones doing the hitting." He paused. "With respect, Professor." McGonagall looked at him with an expression that managed to be several things at once, like she'd been braced for something else, something younger, something less considered, and what she'd gotten instead was requiring her to recalibrate. "With respect," she echoed. "Yes. Of course." She straightened. "I want you to know that you have my complete support in whatever proceedings arise from Madame Pomfrey's findings. And I want you to know that my door is available to you at any time." "Thank you," Harry said. Genuinely. She nodded. He could see she wanted to say more, something more personal, perhaps, something that would close the distance between the formal and the human. But she was a woman who dealt in competence rather than warmth, and so she said, "You'll want to get to your next class," and he said, "Yes, Professor," and they were both comfortable with that, and it was the most comfortable exchange he'd had with an adult who knew the situation yet. He was building a map of his allies. McGonagall was on it. The name dropped at lunch. Not from any particular source, it emerged the way these things always emerged, from the intersection of several partial accounts acquiring enough detail to become specific. Harry was sitting at the Gryffindor table eating chicken pie when he became aware that the student 3 seats down had said, "Potter," in a particular tone and glanced toward him in the quick, guilty way people glance when they think they're being subtle. He kept eating. By the time he'd finished, Potter was circulating up and down the table with the velocity of information released into a hungry vacuum, and people were looking at him with an assortment of expressions ranging from curious to pitying to that particular kind of awe that attaches to suffering when it's someone else's. Ron was emitting a low-level hostility toward the general ambient noise of the table that suggested he'd noticed and had opinions. Hermione had gone very still in her "I am processing something" mode. "You know," Ron said, to no one in particular, in a voice that carried. "It's pretty rotten, talking about someone's medical information like it's gossip." The section of the table within earshot went slightly quieter. "Just a thought," Ron added, and returned to his pie. Harry didn't say anything. He thought, not for the first time, that Ron Weasley was enormously useful and not in the way most people would think. He looked up once, to scan the hall, to see where the murmur had gotten to. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was talking in a low voice to 2 large boys who'd been introduced as Crabbe and Goyle. Malfoy glanced over, caught Harry's eye, and looked away. Harry filed that as interesting. At the staff table, Snape was cutting his chicken with surgical precision and apparently ignoring the hall entirely. But his attention moved once to Harry, briefly, and returned to his plate. It was the kind of attention you give something you've decided not to react to, deliberate inattention. Harry noted it with interest. He finished his lunch. He was fine. He was, he decided, going to be fine about people knowing, because being fine about things was useful and because the alternative, being visibly uncomfortable, was information he'd spent years not giving people for free. The note arrived between lunch and afternoon lessons, delivered by a school owl who landed on Harry's shoulder in the corridor with ruffled dignity. "Mr. Potter, please come to my office this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Use the gargoyle entrance on the 3rd floor. The password is Sherbet Lemon." Albus Dumbledore. Harry folded it neatly and put it in his pocket. "Dumbledore?" Hermione asked, because she had, of course, read the letterhead over his shoulder. "At 3. Do you want us to come?" He considered it. "No. But I want you to know the password, and I want you to come if I'm not back by 5. Hermione's expression moved through several things quickly. "Harry, I don't think anything bad will happen. I just like having contingencies." He said it as neutrally as he'd say anything else, and Hermione processed it and nodded with the kind of pragmatic acceptance that he was coming to understand was her way of saying, "I understand you and I'm not going to make it weird." 5 o'clock, she said. "I'll bring Ron." "Good." The gargoyle knew the password and leapt aside with an enthusiasm that suggested it was happy to have something to do. The spiral staircase carried Harry upward and he rode it with his hands in his pockets and his mind running through the conversation he expected to have, the questions that would come, the things he was willing to say and the things he was going to say regardless of whether he was willing. He had spent a long time being an 11-year-old without any actual power. He had spent that time learning that power wasn't only about size or authority, it was about information, about composure, about knowing what you needed and being able to ask for it clearly. He walked up the spiral staircase toward Albus Dumbledore's office with the calm of someone who has done their homework. The office was extraordinary in the way that Hogwarts itself was extraordinary, not showy but accumulative, 10 or 15 centuries of significance layered into the physical space, every surface occupied by something with a history. Instruments Harry didn't recognize turned and breathed on their silver stands. Portraits of former headmasters observed from their frames with the benign attention of people who have seen many versions of many conversations and found them mostly interesting. A large bird, a phoenix, Harry recognized it from his library reading, watched him from its perch with eyes like molten copper. Dumbledore was standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the grounds. He turned when Harry entered. "Harry. Thank you for coming." He gestured to the chairs by the desk. "Please, sit." Harry sat. He chose the chair that had the desk to his left and the door in his peripheral vision. Old habit. Dumbledore sat across from him and for a moment simply looked at him with those blue eyes that were currently at half their usual twinkling capacity, or rather, the twinkle was present but something behind it was not performing serenity. Something behind it was, Harry assessed, genuinely uncomfortable. "Before we discuss the legal proceedings," Dumbledore said, "would like to say something that isn't administrative." "All right. I placed you with your aunt and uncle. It was my decision. I made it believing it was the best available option, for reasons that, some of which I'll explain today and some of which will require you to be somewhat older to fully understand. But I made it, and what Madame Pomfrey's scan documented is, in some meaningful sense, a consequence of that decision." He paused. "I am sorry, Harry." Harry sat with that for a moment. He looked at the phoenix, who looked back. He thought about what Dumbledore's apology was doing, whether it was strategic, performative, genuine, and he concluded it was genuine, which made it more interesting but not more satisfying. Genuine apologies from people who made bad decisions with good intentions were the most complicated kind. "Thank you," Harry said. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did you know? Before yesterday. Did you have any information that suggested things at Privet Drive were not all right?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is itself an answer. "I received reports," he said carefully. "General well-being assessments, through magical means. The information they returned was interpreted, perhaps, with less scrutiny than it deserved." "By you," Harry said. "Not accusingly. Just clarifying the subject." "Largely by me, yes." "And the healing charms? The 64. Those would have been in those reports." A pause. "Traces of healing magic in your signature, yes. I attributed them, in early years, to the particular pressures of a child raised in a Muggle environment. Minor accidents." He said this last part with a flatness that sounded like a man reading out evidence against himself. "Minor accidents," Harry repeated. "Yes. That's..." Harry stopped. He took a breath, not because he was upset, but because he was choosing how to continue. "That's an interesting interpretation of the data," he said, evenly. Dumbledore looked at him. It was a comfortable one. "Yes." The silence that followed was one of the more honest silences Harry had sat in. Dumbledore didn't try to fill it with reassurances. He just sat in it, and Harry thought that this was probably the most accurately he'd ever seen a very powerful man hold themselves accountable for something, which made him two things at once, more sympathetic toward Dumbledore and more aware that sympathy and trust were different currencies. "The Department of Magical Child Welfare," Harry said, moving them forward. "What happens now?" Dumbledore accepted the redirect. He leaned forward slightly and his voice shifted back into the register of practical authority, which was where Harry found him easiest to work with. "I've been in contact with Madame Marchbanks at the Wisengamot this morning. Given the documentation from yesterday's scan, and given that you are a minor and a ward of the Wizarding State until a permanent guardian is established, they'll open a formal case review. That will likely happen within the next 2 weeks. And the Dursleys will be required to give testimony." Harry nodded. "I'd like to give testimony as well." "That is your right," and I will support it. I'd also like to request that my testimony be given in writing as well as verbally, so that it's entered into the record before the hearing rather than only during it. That way it can't be summarized or softened by whoever presents the case." Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. The phoenix made a low sound like a question. "Harry. How did you?" "The library," Harry said. "The Magical Authority of Minors Handbook, Section 12, Subsection 4. Subjects under the age of majority have the right to submit written testimony in advance of any Wisengamot proceeding concerning their welfare." "Yes," Dumbledore said slowly. "They do. I'd like to exercise that right. I'll arrange it." "Thank you." Harry paused. He was going to say the next part and he was going to say it clearly. "I'd also like to discuss guardianship. Not today, necessarily, but in the near future. I don't want to be placed somewhere by default. I want to understand what options exist and I want to have a say in whatever decision is made." Dumbledore studied him with that expression Harry had seen once before, yesterday, on the examination bed, the recalibrating expression. "You are 11 years old," he said, but the way he said it was more observation than objection. "Yes," Harry said. "And I've been effectively managing my own living situation since I was about 8. I don't think that stops being true because I'm at Hogwarts." He met the blue eyes and held them comfortably. "I'm not asking to make the final decision. I know I can't. I'm asking to be part of the conversation." "You will be," Dumbledore said. And then, with something that changed the register of the room slightly, "You remind me, in some ways, of another student I once knew. The same quality of self-possession." Harry waited to see if this was going somewhere useful. "It's a compliment," Dumbledore said, with something that was almost the full twinkle. "Most of the time." "Who was the student?" "A beat. We'll save that for another day." Harry filed it. He'd return to it. They talked for another 40 minutes, going through the practical sequence of events, the timeline, who would be contacted, what Harry needed to do and when. Dumbledore was careful and thorough, and Harry asked good questions, and by the end of it he had a reasonably complete picture of the next 2 weeks. He also had 2 things he hadn't anticipated getting from this conversation: a better understanding of why Dumbledore made the decisions he made, and a clearer sense of the man's actual character, which was more interesting and more flawed than the figure at the top of the staff table had suggested. At 3:45 Harry stood to leave, and Dumbledore walked him to the door of the office. "One more thing," Harry said, and Dumbledore paused. "The blood protection. The reason you placed me there in the first place. Will it still function if I don't, if Privet Drive is no longer my home?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "It will need to be renewed through different means," he said carefully. "It's something we'll need to discuss further, once the legal situation is settled." "Is there danger I should be aware of?" Harry asked. "Currently. There is always some level of threat attached to your name," Dumbledore said. "But nothing immediate that concerns me. You are safe within Hogwarts." "Good," Harry said. He said it without relief and without fear, the same way he'd said everything else today, as someone noting a useful fact. "I'll want to discuss the blood protection thing more, though. When there's time." "Of course," Dumbledore said. He paused, and again Harry caught the expression, that quiet recalibrating. "Harry. What you're doing, the way you're approaching all of this. It's quite remarkable." "I'm approaching it like a problem," Harry said simply. "That's how I approach most things." "And is it working? For you? As a way of handling it?" Harry considered that honestly. "Mostly," he said. "I'll let you know if it stops." He went down the spiral staircase, and the gargoyle leapt back into place behind him, and he walked out into the corridor where, precisely as promised, Hermione and Ron were waiting at the far end with the looks of people who had been waiting while pretending not to wait. "Well?" Hermione said. "Good meeting," Harry said. Come on. I need to write some testimony and I want your help with the structure. There was one other person Harry wanted to talk to before the day was over. This wasn't strategic. It was curiosity, which was sometimes the same thing. He found Professor Snape at 5:30, in a corridor near the dungeons where Snape was walking toward his office with the stride of a man who walked like the corridor belonged to him. Harry came from the other direction and they would either have to acknowledge each other or perform an elaborate mutual avoidance, and Harry didn't see the point of avoidance. Professor Snape, he said. Snape stopped. He looked at Harry with those dark eyes that operated in a register Harry found interesting, not warm, not hostile, but measuring, the same way a craftsman looks at raw material. Potter. I wondered if I could ask you a question. You may ask. Whether I answer is a different matter. Fair, Harry said. He'd thought about how to phrase this on the way down from Dumbledore's office. At the sorting feast. You were watching me. Not just, the way teachers watch students. You were watching me specifically. Snape's expression didn't change. It was already exactly as still as it could be, which was its own kind of tell. I've been told you knew my parents, Harry said. Who told you that? Hagrid mentioned it in passing. And you have the look of someone who has an existing relationship with this situation. Something moved in Snape's face. Very brief, very controlled, but Harry had spent 10 years reading faces and he caught it. Your mother, Snape said, after a moment, was one of the most gifted witches of her generation. She was also we were friends, for a time. He said this with the flatness of a man delivering a fact he has made peace with by removing its warmth. Your father and I were not. I know, Harry said. I know my father and you didn't get on. That's fine. I'm not him. He paused. I'm not asking you to, I'm not asking for anything, actually. I just wanted to understand what I was looking at. Snape considered him with that measuring expression. What are you looking at, then? A man who has some history with my family that's complicated and who appears to be deciding what to do about that now that I'm here. Harry kept his voice even. I'm not trying to be rude. I find it easier to know what's in the room. The silence lasted a few seconds. Snape's expression had moved through something and settled somewhere that was less hostile than Harry had expected. You're observant, Snape said. Not a compliment, exactly, but not nothing either. I had to be, Harry said. Another brief pause. And then something happened that Harry hadn't anticipated, Snape said, quietly and with no particular inflection. The Department of Magical Child Welfare will want a witness from the magical community who has some standing and who can speak to the nature of your placement. I have served as a ministry witness before. If it's required, I would be willing. Harry looked at him. Snape looked back with the expression of a man who had just done something he hadn't planned to do and was now dealing with that fact. Thank you, Harry said. Snape gave a single, short nod. He resumed walking toward his office. Harry watched him go. There was a debt there, he thought. Something old and complicated. He didn't know what it was yet. But he'd noted it. That night, Harry wrote 6 pages of testimony. He wrote it at the desk in the corner of the dormitory while the other boys slept, the curtains around his bed left open because he'd never liked closed curtains, the single candle doing enough. He wrote it in the same register he'd spoken to Dumbledore, factual, sequenced, without embellishment, each incident described in plain language that was its own argument. He didn't write it as a victim. He wrote it as a witness who happened to have been there. He listed the cupboard under the stairs. He listed the chores. He listed the Christmas mornings and the school uniforms 3 sizes too large and the food that was given as a reward or withheld as a punishment. He listed the specific incidents, the broken ribs at 3, the sprained wrist at 5, the time at 7 that he'd needed stitches and had instead received a whispered charm from Petunia that left a scar because she'd done it wrong. He listed them without performance of feeling, and as he listed them he noticed that the act of writing them down was doing something, not upsetting him, but making the events more solid, like they'd existed before in something like memory fog and were now being converted into record. This had happened. It was a fact now, formally. He had been 3 years old and he had been hurt and it was documented. He sat with that for a moment. Then he went back to writing, because there were 3 more pages to go and he wanted to finish before midnight. The candle burned down. He finished. He read it back once, checked it for precision, made 2 small edits, and set it aside to dry. He lay back on his bed, the softest surface, still, that he'd ever slept on, and looked at the ceiling. Down the hall, Ron made a sound in his sleep that was probably a Quidditch dream. From another bed, Dean Thomas's breathing was slow and even. The dormitory smelled like old wood and candle smoke and someone's peppermint toothpaste. Harry thought about Snape saying willing, with that flat voice that was covering something it had decided to do anyway. He thought about McGonagall and her precisely restrained distress. He thought about Hermione already in the right section of the library, about Ron saying what do we do. He thought about Dumbledore saying I am sorry, Harry, and meaning it, and what it meant that meaning it hadn't been enough. He thought about 64 healing charms and what each of them meant, and then he deliberately set that down, the way you set something heavy down when you've carried it far enough for one day, and he closed his eyes. The castle breathed. Somewhere a portrait was having a very quiet argument. A suit of armor somewhere below shifted and clunked with the random domestic sound of an old building settling. Harry slept. In the morning, the Daily Prophet arrived. Harry was already at breakfast. He was eating eggs and reading over Hermione's notes on the Wizarding Child Welfare Act when the owl dropped the paper in front of Neville Longbottom, who was sitting nearby and had the Prophet subscription. Neville unrolled it, read the front page, and went slightly pink. Harry, Neville said carefully. I know, Harry said, without looking up. It's on the front page. Harry looked up then. He read the headline from across the table. Harry Potter's first Hogwarts health check reveals years of unreported harm. Wizengamot to open formal review. Below it was a photograph of him that he didn't recognize, clearly taken at King's Cross 2 days ago, slightly out of focus, him pushing his trolley, not looking at the camera. He looked small in it. He noted this and set it aside. He looked at the byline. Rita Skeeter. Brilliant, said Hermione, with the tone of someone for whom brilliant was not a compliment. She got the facts mostly right, Harry said, scanning the article. He read fast, efficiently. Some of the framing is off. She's playing up the tragedy angle. He set the paper down. That's not necessarily bad for the proceedings. The Wizengamot responds to public attention. If the public is paying attention, they'll move faster and more carefully. Both Ron and Hermione stared at him. What? Harry said. You just read that and your first thought was how it affects the legal proceedings, Ron said. Should it have been something else? Ron appeared to be trying to formulate a response. Hermione saved him. Harry, it's a full front page story about you. In the Prophet. On your 3rd day at Hogwarts. Yes. Harry picked his fork back up. I know. Can we read Skeeter's source? Someone talked to her. I'd like to know who. Neville passed the paper over obligingly. It says a ministry source, Neville said. Close to the Department of Magical Child Welfare. Someone there leaked it. Ministry politics, Harry said. He was thinking about that. Someone wants this case moving publicly. They're using the press to put pressure on the hearing timeline. He paused. That might actually be useful for me. Hermione watched him with an expression that was part admiration, part concern, part something she hadn't fully identified yet. You know, she said, very carefully, most people who found their personal medical history on the front page of the national newspaper would be a little bit upset. I'm a little bit upset, Harry said honestly. But being upset about it won't do anything useful and thinking about it might. He looked up at her. I'm not made of stone. I have a hierarchy. Feelings and then strategy. The strategy takes longer. Where are you in the feelings part? She asked quietly. He thought about it genuinely, giving it the attention it deserved. Maybe 60% through, he said. I'll let you know when I'm done. Hermione held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Ron refilled Harry's tea without being asked, which was, Harry thought, exactly the right thing to do. At the Slytherin table, Malfoy was reading the Prophet with a face Harry couldn't quite read from this distance. At the staff table, Snape's copy of the paper was folded beside his plate, and Snape was not looking at it. At the center of the high table, Dumbledore's seat remained empty. The great hall hummed. Owls came and went. The enchanted ceiling showed autumn clouds, and the light coming through was the particular gold of early morning, the kind of light that makes things look more significant than they are or exactly as significant as they are. Harry drank his tea and finished his eggs and thought about what came next, and outside the castle the grounds were still with the particular stillness of a place that has been waiting, patiently, for a very long time, for the person sitting inside it to start fighting back. He was starting. Chapter 3, What the Wizengamot Owes. The letter from the Department of Magical Child Welfare arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after the scan. Harry had been expecting it. He'd been tracking the approximate timeline from the Magical Authority of Minors Handbook and had revised his estimate twice based on how quickly the Prophet story had moved. Public pressure, as he'd predicted, had accelerated things considerably. When the official ministry owl arrived at breakfast and dropped a sealed envelope bearing the golden seal of the Wizengamot directly onto his plate with the finality of a legal instrument being served, he set down his toast and opened it without drama. Ron watched him read it. Hermione had leaned over before the wax was fully broken. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday. Courtroom 10, Ministry of Magic, London. 9 o'clock in the morning. Harry Potter was summoned as primary subject of the review, with the right to present testimony, question witnesses, and be represented by a qualified advocate if he chose. Vernon and Petunia Dursley had been summoned as respondents. Tuesday, Ron said. Tuesday, Harry confirmed. He folded the letter. That's fast. The Prophet ran 3 follow-up stories, Hermione said. She'd been monitoring the coverage with the focused intensity of someone running an intelligence operation. 2 opinion pieces calling for immediate action, 1 interview with a former member of the Child Welfare Department who retired 4 years ago and apparently has strong views about the oversight failures of the last decade. I think Dumbledore may also have made some informal contacts. He would, Harry said. He wasn't bothered by that. Dumbledore applying pressure in the right direction was useful, as long as Harry understood it was happening and why. He looked at the letter again. Tuesday. 6 days. He thought about Vernon Dursley in a courtroom. He thought about Petunia. He tried to access something like fear about that and found only the familiar low-grade alertness, the practical assessment. They were going to have to answer questions. They were not going to be able to manage the situation the way they managed things at Privet Drive, through intimidation and isolation and the reliable fact that no one was paying attention. People were paying attention now. Harry found this enormously satisfying in a way he kept quiet about because it seemed uncharitable to say aloud. I need an advocate, he said. The letter says I can have one. Who does that? Who does that in the wizarding world? Hermione was already opening her copy of Magical Law, a comprehensive guide, which she had checked out of the library 4 days ago and hadn't returned. There's a section on Wizengamot proceedings, she said. Advocates they're not quite the same as Muggle solicitors but they function similarly. Most are registered with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She was scanning pages. There are a few names mentioned as having done welfare cases specifically. A witch called Millicent Bagnold retired in '90, so she's out. She paused. Arthur Weasley is listed as having served as a welfare advocate in 3 cases in the mid-80s, but he's in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office now and probably can't, Dad? Ron had been listening with increasing interest. Dad's done welfare hearings? Apparently. Ron looked at Harry with the expression of someone putting something together. He'd do it. For you, I mean. Mum and Dad have been following the Prophet stories. I got a letter from Mum yesterday that was, he made a gesture suggesting the letter had been significant in volume. She sent fudge and told me to make sure you were eating properly. Harry experienced a brief, unguarded moment of something he quickly organized back into composure. Your mother sent me fudge? She sent enough fudge for the whole dormitory, honestly, but the point is, would you want Dad? He knows the system. He knows the ministry. And he'd actually care about getting it right. Harry thought about this. Arthur Weasley, whom he'd met briefly, in the chaos of King's Cross, a man with the same ease as Ron but with more years behind it, who had shaken Harry's hand and looked at him with the specific warmth of someone who was glad to meet you rather than glad to meet your name. He thought about the difference between having an advocate because it was required and having one who would be fighting. Yes, Harry said. If he's willing. I'll write him today, Ron said, and he was already reaching for parchment with an enthusiasm that suggested writing letters was generally not his preferred activity, but this particular letter was worthwhile. Hermione was watching Harry again with that quiet assessment. Are you nervous? She asked, low enough that it was just for him. About the hearing? About seeing them? Your aunt and uncle? Harry considered the question honestly, because she'd asked it honestly. I don't think so, he said. I think I'm interested to see what they do when they can't control the room. He paused. That's probably not a healthy thing to say. It's an honest thing to say, Hermione said. I think that's better. He picked his toast back up. Down the table, Neville was reading the Prophet with the careful attention he gave everything, and he looked up and caught Harry's eye and gave him a small nod, not a nod of acknowledgement exactly, more of a nod that said I see you, I'm not going to make a fuss about it, carry on, and Harry returned it, and there was something in that small exchange that was worth noting. Neville Longbottom understood something about being managed and underestimated and required to be less than you were. Harry didn't know the details yet. But the understanding was there between them, wordless and precise. Arthur Weasley sent his reply by return owl on Friday morning. He would be honored. He had already begun reviewing the documentation Madame Pomfrey had submitted to the ministry. He would arrive at Hogwarts on Monday afternoon to meet with Harry and prepare. He also sent, tucked into the letter, a small note in a different handwriting that said, Harry dear, Ron tells me you've been eating well, which is a relief. I've sent more fudge. Please make sure you sleep properly. Molly Weasley. Harry read this 3 times. He did it in the dormitory, alone, sitting on the edge of his bed before breakfast, and no one was there to see the 3 times, which was fine. He folded the note carefully and put it in his trunk, at the bottom, under his textbooks, in a place that was not convenient but was deliberate. Monday came with the pace of a week that has something significant at the end of it. Classes felt slightly unreal, or rather, Harry felt slightly displaced from them, present and attentive but with some portion of his processing elsewhere, running through the hearing, the testimony he'd written, the questions he anticipated, the answers he'd prepared. He answered questions in class. He completed his first charms practical with a precision that earned him a nod from Professor Flitwick that was worth something. He ate. He slept. He was, functionally, fine. The thing about having a very well-developed survival mechanism was that it didn't turn off just because you were safe. It redirected. Arthur Weasley arrived at 4 on Monday afternoon. Harry met him in a small sitting room off the main entrance hall that McGonagall had made available, and Arthur came in with a ministry briefcase and the particular energy of a man who takes things seriously without making them heavy. He shook Harry's hand and sat down and opened the briefcase, and they got straight to it. He was good. Harry noticed this immediately, Arthur Weasley had the kind of legal mind that operated through empathy rather than cold logic, which was its own particular skill. He'd read the full diagnostic report, all 64 entries, and he'd organized them by type and severity and chronology, and he walked Harry through how they'd be presented to the Wizengamot in a way that made the evidence hard to contest. "The Dursleys will have representation," Arthur said. "I've been told through ministry channels they've retained a solicitor, Muggle-trained, actually, which is unusual. A man called Doris Crockford, no, sorry, he checked his notes. Tobias Knott. He has some experience with the Wizengamot on Muggle interface cases. He'll likely argue that the healing charms were applied in good faith, that Petunia was trying to help. She was trying to hide evidence," Harry said. "Yes. But his argument will be that the intent was care, not concealment." Arthur looked at him directly. "The Wizengamot will want to believe the more comfortable story. People generally do. That's the thing we're working against. Then we make the uncomfortable story impossible to avoid," Harry said. Arthur studied him for a moment with the look his son had, that particular Weasley assessment that was too honest to be called diplomatic. "You've thought about this quite a bit." "For about 8 days, intensively. For longer, in other ways." "Right." Arthur put his elbows on the table and looked at Harry the way Harry's testimony had asked to be looked at, directly, without softening. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer changes nothing about how hard I fight tomorrow. It's just so I know where you are." "Okay," Harry said. "What do you want to happen to them?" Harry had thought about this. He'd thought about it carefully, testing his own motivations for anything that was about pain rather than outcome, because he'd decided somewhere in the last 8 days that he was not going to let what had happened to him make him into someone who wanted punishment for its own sake. That felt like a choice worth making. "I want them formally charged," he said. "I want the record to exist. I want it to be publicly documented that what they did was wrong and that the magical world failed to stop it." He paused. "I don't want them in Azkaban. I don't actually want them to suffer. I want them to be held accountable and I want to be legally and permanently separated from them." He met Arthur's eyes. "And I want it to be impossible for anyone to quietly reverse." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's very clear. I've had 8 days." "Yes." Arthur opened another file. "Then here's how we build the case." They worked for 2 hours. By the time Harry climbed the stairs toward dinner, he had a clear map of tomorrow, what would be said, in what order, by whom, what the Dursleys' defense would likely look like and how to counter it, what the Wizengamot members would need to hear and how to ensure they heard it. He also had something he hadn't anticipated from 2 hours in a room with Arthur Weasley, a feeling that was difficult to name but might have been, in some essential way, the feeling of having someone in your corner who was there because they chose to be. He walked into the great hall and sat down and ate roast beef and listened to Ron complain warmly about the Transfiguration homework and watched Hermione eat with one hand and make notes with the other and felt the castle around him, warm and enormous and old, and thought, tomorrow. The Ministry of Magic was everything Harry had not expected and entirely what the wizarding world had been so far, excessive, magnificent, and completely unconcerned with whether you found it excessive. The telephone box entrance was a detail he filed away as characteristically bizarre. The atrium was all gleaming golden walls and rushing workers and the general atmosphere of important business being conducted at speed. Arthur had collected him at 7. Hermione and Ron had both been awake to see him off in the common room. Ron had said, "Knock 'em dead," with complete sincerity and then looked briefly embarrassed by the phrasing, and Hermione had handed him a 3-page summary of the key legal precedents in order of relevance, which he'd pocketed without comment because it was exactly what he needed. McGonagall had been at the entrance hall when they left. She'd looked at Harry and then at Arthur and said, "Mr. Weasley, I expect a full report," and Arthur had said, "Minerva, obviously," and Harry had observed this exchange as further data on the network of people who were, apparently, fighting for him. The network was larger than he'd expected. He was still adjusting to that. Courtroom 10 was underground, reached by elevator, and when the doors opened Harry felt the particular quality of the air change, denser, older, the way very serious places feel, the weight of many significant decisions having been made in them. He walked through stone corridors and down stone steps and through a heavy wooden door and into the courtroom. It was smaller than he'd imagined and larger than it needed to be. The Wisengamot members were arranged in tiered seats that wrapped three sides of the room, 40-something witches and wizards in plum-colored robes, which from Harry's vantage point as he entered looked something like a theater audience, except that they were watching him and the weight of their combined attention was palpable. At the center was a raised chair with chains, the Wisengamot's interrogation chair, which Harry had read about. The chains lay loose. He looked at them without flinching and took his seat at the advocate's table beside Arthur, who had arranged parchment and files with the organized efficiency of someone who had done this before. Across the room, at the respondents' table, were Vernon and Petunia Dursley. Harry looked at them. Petunia was thinner than he remembered, or maybe it was the formal setting that made her seem diminished, the absence of her house and her kitchen and her established authority in both. She was wearing her Sunday clothes and she was holding herself the way she'd always held herself, the narrow, effortful dignity of a woman who cares very much about appearing not to care. She was not looking at Harry. Vernon was. Vernon was looking at Harry with his small eyes gone very small indeed, the expression Harry knew well, contained rage, the kind that couldn't discharge here because there was no safe outlet for it. He was red in the face and very still. Harry observed both of them and felt very little. He had wondered if he would feel something large, fear, anger, grief. What he felt was the low, clear alertness he'd felt all week. He was in a room where he had the advantage, and he knew it, and he was going to use it, and that was the whole of what this moment was. He looked away from them and back at Arthur, who was making a last note. At the head of the room, the chief warlock called the session to order. The Wisengamot's proceedings moved in a formal, stately register that Harry had read about but found somewhat different in practice, more human, more responsive to the room than he'd expected. The chief warlock, a square-jawed wizard named Croaker who had the measured manner of someone who had chaired many rooms like this one, opened with a summary of the case, the mandatory health screening, the diagnostic results, the 64 healing charms, the timeline spanning 8 years. He spoke without editorial comment, but the facts themselves didn't need editorial comment. 40-something faces in plum robes absorbed these facts. Some of them looked at Harry. He met their eyes when they did, not confrontationally, but steadily. Arthur went first on Harry's behalf. He was good at this in exactly the way Harry had assessed. He presented the evidence with the calm precision of someone who trusts the evidence to do the work. He walked through Pomfrey's secondary diagnostic, entry by entry. He placed dates beside ages and ages beside medical descriptions. He put the partial healing of a 3-year-old's ribs on the record and let the silence that followed sit exactly as long as it needed to. Tobias Knott, the Dursley's advocate, was sharp and well-prepared and did the thing Arthur had predicted. He argued care, not cruelty. He argued a woman unfamiliar with magical healing attempting to assist her nephew with available means. He argued that the Muggle context explained the secrecy, that fear of misunderstanding, not concealment of harm, had driven the decisions. He was controlled and he was professional and he was working with material that was fundamentally insufficient. Harry watched him work and noted the points where he was effective and the points where the evidence overwhelmed him, and when the time came for Harry to speak, he stood up and the room shifted. He had 6 pages of testimony. He didn't read from them. He'd memorized them over the past week the way he'd always memorized things, efficiently and completely, and he knew them the way he knew exit locations, automatically, at depth. He spoke from standing without notes, which he'd decided because reading from paper made you smaller and he was already small enough in this room. He spoke in the same register he'd used with Dumbledore and McGonagall and Arthur, factual, sequenced, direct. He described his first memory of magic in clear, specific terms. He described the cupboard. He described 8 years of meals and chores and the careful calibration of the line between discomfort and visible harm. He described each healing charm he was aware of having been applied, the circumstances, what had preceded each one and what had followed. He spoke about it the way you speak about things you have had a long time to understand, without the jaggedness of fresh wound. At the respondents' table, Petunia Dursley had gone very still. Vernon Dursley's face had moved through 3 different colors during the opening entries and was now a single, fixed shade of dark red. The Wizengamot was silent. When Harry finished speaking, Croaker said, "Thank you, Mr. Potter," in a voice that was doing the same thing Pomfrey's had done, covering something hot with something professional. Nott rose to cross-examine. "Mr. Potter," he said, in the measured tones of a man constructing a credible alternative. "You've described your home environment in considerable detail. I'd like to ask about your perspective as a child. It's possible, isn't it, that some of what you've described as neglect could be interpreted differently by an adult aware of the full context?" "No," Harry said. Nott paused. "I beg your pardon?" "No. It couldn't." Harry kept his voice level. "A 3-year-old with broken ribs who is given a partial healing charm so that a Muggle doctor won't ask questions cannot be interpreted differently based on adult context. A child who sleeps in a cupboard under the stairs from the age of 1 until the age of 10 cannot be interpreted differently based on context. A child who is fed as a reward and not fed as a punishment cannot be interpreted differently. These aren't ambiguous actions. They have one meaning." He paused. "You're welcome to ask me something with an actual ambiguity. I'll engage with that." Nott looked at him. He was too professional to be visibly rattled. But he recalculated. "You stated that Mrs. Dursley applied the healing charms herself. You were very young at the time. How certain are you that it was Mrs. Dursley and not, say, ambient magic from a distressed child?" "Because I saw her do it," Harry said. "When I was 7 and she healed a burn on my arm, I saw her use a wand. I didn't know what a wand was at the time. I now know that it was a wand and that the spell produced the particular blue-gold light that diagnostic records confirm matches Muggle-adapted healing charms from the pre-1970s period, which is the era in which Petunia Dursley would have observed magic being performed in the Evans household before her sister went to Hogwarts." He looked at Nott. "The diagnostic report includes the magical signature type for each healing charm. Madame Pomfrey can confirm the match." Nott turned to Pomfrey, who had been sitting in the witness area with the expression of a woman who had been waiting to be asked. "She confirmed the match. She confirmed it in the concise, authoritative manner of a medical professional who has 25 years of diagnostic experience and finds the question academic." Nott sat down. Petunia was called to testify. Harry watched her walk to the witness area. She moved the way she always moved, carefully, precisely, with the particular dignity of someone who believes that if they hold themselves correctly the situation can be managed. She sat and she smoothed her skirt and she looked at nothing in particular with the careful blankness of someone constructing their own composure in real time. Nott walked her through a prepared account, the difficulties of raising a magical child without magical knowledge, the genuine fear of the magical world, the isolation of Privet Drive from any support system. Petunia answered in the careful tones of a woman who had rehearsed. She spoke about Harry's mother in a voice that didn't quite reach hatred and didn't quite reach grief and landed somewhere that was both. Then Arthur stood. "Mrs. Dursley," Arthur said, with perfect pleasantness. "You received 11 letters from Hogwarts this past summer. Is that correct?" A pause. "Yes. You prevented Harry from receiving those letters." We didn't feel that, yes or no, please." "Yes," she said tightly. "In the summer of 1987, when Harry was 7, he required a hospital visit for what you described to Muggle emergency services as a fall down the stairs. The Muggle medical record shows no treatment beyond observation because the attending doctor found no injuries consistent with the reported fall. Can you explain that?" Petunia's hands tightened in her lap. the fall was minor. He recovered quickly. He recovered quickly because you healed him, Arthur said, with the same pleasantness. Before he reached the hospital. You healed him because the actual injuries weren't consistent with a fall and you knew a Muggle doctor would notice. He paused. Isn't that right? I was trying to help him. You were trying to avoid questions. I was trying to help him, Petunia said, and her voice had gone to a particular place, not defensive, exactly, something stranger, something that sounded almost like she believed it. Harry found this the most interesting thing she'd said. He thought about what it meant to do something harmful to a child and have completely rearranged the memory into something protective. He filed it. He didn't feel anything particular about it. Mrs. Dursley, Arthur said, still pleasant, you have a sister. She was a witch. You watched her leave for Hogwarts when you were what, 9? 10? Petunia said nothing. You know what magical ability looks like. You know what it is. You understood from the beginning that Harry had it. Arthur picked up a parchment. And yet the child welfare filing from his earliest placement notes that the accommodation provided for him was, and I'm quoting directly, a storage space beneath the ground floor staircase, not a designated bedroom. He was placed there at approximately 14 months of age. He set the parchment down. What were you afraid of, Mrs. Dursley? What made you decide, when your sister's infant was placed in your home, that a cupboard was sufficient? Petunia's face had gone from careful to brittle. Something was moving underneath it, old, large, complicated. Harry watched her with genuine curiosity. He had wondered, for years, what the actual root of it was. The answer had always been just out of reach, obscured by the daily practical fact of being on the wrong end of it. He wasn't, she stopped. He reminded me, she said finally, quietly, every day. Every time I looked at him. She was not looking at Harry. She was looking at her hands. He has her eyes. The room was very quiet. Mrs. Dursley, Arthur said, quietly but without softening it, that is not a justification. No, she said. I know. It was the most honest thing Harry had ever heard her say in his life, and it was the worst thing she could have said, because it meant she knew and she'd done it anyway. Harry looked at her and felt something move through him, not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something that was adjacent to comprehension, and he thought that comprehension might be enough. He didn't need to feel anything larger. He didn't need to make this bigger than it was. She had been afraid of what he represented and she had been small about it, and he had paid for her smallness with 10 years and 64 healing charms. He understood that now. It was, he supposed, a kind of answer. Vernon Dursley testified with the energy of a man who has never successfully been held accountable for anything and finds the experience profoundly disorienting. He contradicted himself twice in the first 10 minutes. Arthur noted both contradictions aloud, with the dispassionate precision of a man who doesn't need to raise his voice to land a point. Vernon's face went through the full color spectrum. He said things like, the boy was difficult, and we gave him everything he needed, and Arthur let him say these things and then placed the diagnostic report next to them and left them there to keep each other company. The chamber had the quality of a room in which a decision has already been made. When Vernon was done, the Wisengamot withdrew to deliberate. Harry and Arthur sat in an anteroom with tea, which Harry drank because it was there and he was cold. You were extraordinary, Arthur said. I was prepared, Harry said. Both things can be true. Arthur looked at him with the quiet warmth that seemed to be his natural register. Your parents would be, he stopped, the way adults stopped when they started a sentence they weren't sure they had the right to finish. You can say it, Harry said. Arthur looked at him. They would be very proud, he said simply. Harry didn't say anything. He drank his tea. He looked at the stone wall across from him and thought about Lily Potter with her eyes that he apparently had, and James Potter who he knew almost nothing about, and what it meant to be proud of someone you hadn't met yet. What it meant that your parents would be proud and you would never know it from them directly. He filed this not under things to process later but under things that are true and are allowed to matter. It was allowed to matter. He sat with it. The deliberation took 40 minutes. They came back to the chamber and Harry and Arthur took their seats and Croker stood and read the findings. Vernon and Petunia Dursley were found responsible for sustained neglect and documented harm to a minor in their care. The healing charms, rather than mitigating the charge, were treated as evidence of deliberate concealment. Vernon was given a 2-year suspended sentence and a prohibition on contact with any person under 17 years of age for a period of 5 years. Petunia received a formal caution and a mandatory course of magical legal education regarding the rights of magical minors. Harry's guardianship was formally dissolved. He was made a ward of the Wizarding State pending a permanent guardianship arrangement. The state wardship would be administered through Hogwarts, with Dumbledore as nominal guardian for the duration of his education. The terms specified that summer arrangements were to be agreed by Harry himself and the guardian of his choosing, with no requirement to return to any previous placement. The last part had been Arthur's addition to the filing. Harry had noted it with appreciation. Croker read the formal statement of the board, that the oversight failure of the past decade was a matter of serious institutional concern and that a review of the mandatory health screening program's protocols for investigating flagged results would be conducted. This, Harry understood, was directed at the Ministry, and in some meaningful sense, at Dumbledore, without saying so directly. Harry sat in the tiered chamber and listened to the Wizengamot formally acknowledge that what had happened to him was wrong, and that it was on the record, and that the machinery of the magical world had turned, however slowly and imperfectly, in the direction of doing something about it. He had walked into this room with a diagnostic report and 6 pages of memorized testimony and 2 hours of preparation with Arthur Weasley. He walked out of it with his life changed, legally and permanently, in exactly the ways he had calculated. Outside the courtroom, in the stone corridor that felt slightly less oppressive than it had 2 hours ago, they passed the Dursleys. It was not planned, simply the geometry of the building, both parties heading toward the same elevator. Petunia looked at Harry and he looked back at her. Vernon looked at the wall. Harry stopped. He wasn't sure why. Some instinct that wasn't fear and wasn't anger, something that needed a conclusion. Petunia, he said, quietly. She looked at him. Her face was doing several things at once, none of which she was managing well. I have her eyes, he said. I know. I'm sorry that was difficult for you. He paused. I'm not sorry that I exist. But I understand that it was hard. She said nothing. Her mouth opened slightly and closed again. I won't contact you, Harry said. I don't expect you to contact me. I think we're both better off. He looked at her steadily. But if you ever want to tell me anything about my mother, anything at all, I'd like to know. She was your sister. He paused. I think you loved her, somewhere under everything else. Petunia's face fractured. Just briefly, just in the eyes, something old and broken surfacing. She swallowed. She said nothing. Harry nodded once, turned, and walked to the elevator with Arthur. Behind him, he heard nothing from Petunia or Vernon. But as the elevator doors closed, he caught, just once, the faint sound of Petunia Dursley doing something he had never heard her do in 10 years of living in her house. He thought it might have been crying. He faced forward and pressed the button for the atrium and thought about Lily Evans with her apparently significant eyes, and he was quiet all the way up. Snape was in the atrium. Harry noticed him before Arthur did, a dark figure standing near the fireplaces with his arms folded and the expression of a man waiting for something he decided to wait for without knowing why. When Harry and Arthur came off the elevator, Snape's eyes went to Harry with that measuring quality, and Harry walked toward him because the alternative was pretending not to have seen him, and that seemed counterproductive. Professor Snape, Harry said. Potter. Snape looked at Arthur briefly. Weasley. Severus, Arthur said, with the mild tone of a man who has a complicated history with someone and has decided to be civil about it. The outcome? Snape said. In Harry's favor, Arthur said. Full guardianship dissolution. Suspended sentence for Vernon. Harry's award of state pending permanent arrangement. Snape absorbed this. His face didn't change in the ways that most faces change when absorbing good news, but something in his posture, very small, very brief, released. Good, he said. Harry looked at him. Were you going to testify? If called, Snape said. Which I was not required to be, in the end. What would you have said? Snape looked at him with those dark eyes, and for once the measuring quality was turned somewhere internal, like he was measuring himself. That I saw you on platform 9 3/4 on September 1st, he said, and that I have done this work long enough to recognize what I was looking at. A pause. I did not ask myself, at the time, why a healthy child had that particular quality. He paused again. I should have. Harry thought about Snape in the Great Hall on the first night, watching him across the room with that controlled attention. He thought about the debt he'd identified in their corridor conversation. He was understanding it better now. You didn't know, Harry said. I should have looked, Snape said. Maybe, Harry said. But you're here now. Snape said nothing. But he didn't look away. I'm going back to Hogwarts, Harry said. I have a charms essay due Thursday. He looked at Snape with something that was almost levity. I'd appreciate it if you didn't take points from Gryffindor for the next week or so. As a general gesture. Something moved in Snape's face that had never been there before in Harry's experience of him and might, in different lighting and with charitable interpretation, have been amusement. Don't push it, Potter, he said. Harry smiled and walked away through the gleaming atrium with Arthur Weasley beside him, past the golden statues and the rushing workers and the fireplaces full of green flame, out into the London afternoon that was cold and ordinary and entirely itself. He was 11 years old and he had just walked out of the Wizengamot with exactly what he'd gone in to get. He put his hands in his pockets and walked. The afternoon light was flat and grey and London smelled like rain. He was, right down to the bone, completely and genuinely fine. Chapter 4, Learning to Want Things. The week after the hearing had a different texture to it. Harry noticed this on Wednesday morning, sitting in the Great Hall at breakfast, when he reached for a second piece of toast without running the arithmetic first. He'd done it before his brain had engaged, hand out, toast in hand, butter applied, and he'd only noticed what had happened when he was already eating it. He sat with that for a moment. The toast was good. He ate it. Small things kept doing this. He'd catch himself reading past midnight not because he needed to but because he wanted to, the book open on his knees in the warm dark of the dormitory, the rest of the world asleep, and the wanting being the whole reason. He'd stop in corridors because a painting caught his eye and he'd just look at it, not cataloging it for information, not assessing it for threat, just looking because it was interesting, and looking at interesting things was apparently something he could do now. He went to breakfast before it was tactically necessary. He slept without listening. None of these things were large. All of them were significant. Hermione noticed. She noticed the way she noticed everything, completely, immediately, and with the instinct to say something about it, but she also had the particular intelligence to understand that saying something about it would make it self-conscious, and that self-conscious was the enemy of the thing she was observing. So she just watched him eat the second piece of toast and looked back at her book and let it be. Ron noticed too, in the way Ron noticed things, not analytically but with the gut instinct of someone who reads people without being aware he's doing it. You seem different, he said one evening, in the common room, without looking up from the chessboard. Good different. I feel different, Harry said, which was honest. Good. Ron moved his knight. Your bishop's about to have a bad time. Harry moved his bishop. Ron's knight demolished it. Harry surveyed the board without distress. I always lose at chess, he said. Everyone loses at chess with me, Ron said, not unkindly. It's one of my best things. What are your other best things? Ron looked up, slightly surprised by the question. Quidditch, well, I want to play, I haven't yet. Eating. Finding things funny that aren't supposed to be funny. He thought about it. I'm good at people, I think. Knowing when something's off. Knowing what someone needs. Harry looked at him across the destroyed chess board. Yes, he said. You are. Ron went slightly pink and moved another piece and said nothing, but something in the set of his shoulders said he'd heard it. Classes had settled into a rhythm that Harry found, somewhat to his own surprise, genuinely enjoyable. Not all of them equally. History of Magic was delivered by a ghost who seemed to be lecturing from notes written in a previous era for an audience long dead, and astronomy was interesting but inconveniently timed, and herbology was fine but not remarkable. But charms was something else entirely. And transfiguration. And defense against the dark arts, for different reasons. Charms came naturally in a way that Harry had stopped trying to explain and started simply accepting. He had always made things happen without meaning to, lights flickering, objects moving, once growing his hair back overnight after Aunt Petunia had cut it nearly to the scalp. Turning that automatic, uncontrolled thing into something directed and precise gave him a satisfaction that was almost physical, the satisfaction of doing something you are built to do. Flitwick had stopped placing him at the front of the class for demonstrations and started placing him at the back, where he could work at his own pace without the rest of the class getting discouraged, which Harry appreciated both tactically and practically. Transfiguration he liked because McGonagall made it clear that transfiguration was difficult and demanding and would reward only genuine engagement, which was the kind of challenge he respected. He worked at it the way he worked at most things, quietly, completely, without announcing his results. Defense against the dark arts was interesting for reasons that had nothing to do with the curriculum. Professor Quirrell taught the subject with the anxious, stuttering quality of a man perpetually on the back foot of his own lecture. He smelled strange. Harry had noticed this on the first day and had simply filed it without conclusion, a sharp, complex smell that was wrong in a way he couldn't yet specify. Incense and something under the incense. He also had the quality that Harry had learned to recognize in the Dursley household, the quality of a person performing their normal self, the slight lag between thought and expression, the way someone looks when they are managing something and hoping you won't notice. Harry noticed. He didn't say anything. He paid attention in class, answered questions correctly, and watched Quirrell the way he'd watched the Dursleys' kitchen when something felt off, not with alarm, but with the patient attention of someone building a picture. After the third defense lesson, walking back up the corridor with Hermione and Ron, Hermione said, "He's getting worse." At teaching? Ron said. He started at about a 3 out of 10, I'm not sure there's much further, not at teaching. At being present. He keeps losing his thread mid-sentence. His turban today, did you notice he kept touching it? Harry had noticed. Yes, he said. Do you think he's sick? Hermione asked. Maybe, Harry said. I think he's not what he appears to be. Hermione and Ron both looked at him. He realized he'd said it with more certainty than he'd meant to. What do you mean? Hermione said. I don't know yet. Something's off. There's something wrong about him that isn't just bad teaching. He paused. I'll keep watching. He filed this separately from the legal proceedings, separately from the ongoing adjustment of being at Hogwarts, in the part of his mind that was patient and could hold things for a long time without resolution. The thing Harry hadn't anticipated about learning to want things was that it came with a version of fear he hadn't dealt with before. Not the useful kind, not the kind that made him careful, that had kept him functional at Privet Drive. A different kind. The kind that comes with having something to lose. He was sitting in the library on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the hearing, doing nothing in particular useful, he had no assignments due until Monday, and the library was warm, and the chair he'd claimed by the window had afternoon light across it, and he'd been reading a book about the history of magical Britain that had nothing to do with any class. He was reading it because he wanted to. The second piece of toast. He was doing it. And then he became aware, in the way you become aware of weather coming, that the thing sitting in his chest was anxiety. Not the functional, problem-solving anxiety. Just the ordinary, useless kind, the kind that came because he was in a warm room in a castle that felt like home and had two friends who were currently somewhere in this building and would come and find him at dinner, and that was good, that was completely good, and the anxiety attached to good things was the fear of losing them. He had spent 10 years with nothing to lose. Having things was new. He sat with it. He let it be there. He didn't try to logic it away, because you couldn't logic emotions away, you could only either let them move through you or shove them somewhere they'd get worse. After a few minutes it subsided into a low background hum that he thought he might have to learn to live with, the way you learn to live with the sound of a river when you live near one. He went back to his book. Neville came into the library 10 minutes later, saw Harry by the window, and without much ceremony sat down across from him with his own stack of books. He didn't say anything. He just sat there and started working on what looked like herbology notes. Harry found this unexpectedly companionable. They sat in silence for 20 minutes. Harry read about the founding of the Ministry of Magic. Neville worked through his herbology notes with the careful attention he gave everything. Neville worked hard in a way that Harry had come to understand was the working of someone who had been told repeatedly that they weren't very good and had decided to fight it every single day with sheer effort. "Neville," Harry said, eventually. Neville looked up. "Your family, your gran raises you, right?" "Yes," Neville said. "My parents are." He paused with the pause of someone who has given this information before and has found a version of it they can say without it destroying the conversation. "They're in St. Mungo's." "They were," Bellatrix Lestrange tortured them. "With the Cruciatus curse. They've been there since I was a baby." He said this with the same quality Harry recognized in himself, not the flatness of someone who doesn't feel it, but the careful management of someone who has felt it for so long that they've learned to hold it at a usable distance. "I'm sorry," Harry said. "Thank you." Neville looked at him with his round, honest face. "I read about what happened with your hearing. In the Prophet." "I know. Everyone did. My gran wrote to me about it." She said. Neville stopped, then continued. "She said that the magical world has a long history of failing to protect children and that it was about time someone made it answer for that." He paused. "Coming from my gran, that's fairly revolutionary." Harry almost smiled. "How is she?" "Your grandmother." "Very much herself." Neville said this with the complicated love of someone whose primary caregiver is formidable in ways that are not always easy to live with. "She's proud of me for being at Hogwarts. She keeps expecting me to be someone else." "Your father," Harry said. "Not a question." Neville looked at him. "Yes. You're not him," Harry said. "You're you. And you're good at things he probably wasn't." He thought about Neville in herbology, the way the plant seemed to respond to him, the easy certainty in his hands when he was doing something he loved. "He was a great orator, right? But I don't think he could do what you did with that mandrake yesterday." Neville stared at him. It just needed repotting at the right time, you knew exactly when. You were the only one who noticed it was ready. Professor Sprout noticed you noticing." Harry looked at him steadily. "You know things, Neville. They're just different things than the things people expect you to know." Neville was quiet for a moment, doing something careful with his face. Then he said, "You're very direct. Is that all right?" "Yes," Neville said, after a moment. "Actually, yes. Yes." He went back to his herbology notes, but he was sitting differently. Slightly more upright. Harry turned a page. They stayed in the library until dinner. Hermione had a problem. Harry knew she had a problem because Hermione had several modes: focused, curious, enthusiastic, and the one she was currently in, which was the quiet, tight-lipped concentration of someone who has identified something wrong and has not yet decided what to do about it. She'd been in that mode since Tuesday morning, and it was now Friday evening and the situation had not resolved. "Tell me," Harry said, sitting next to her in the common room after dinner. Ron was playing chess with Dean Thomas nearby, providing live commentary that Dean was ignoring. Hermione looked at him. "Tell you what? Whatever it is." She studied him for a moment with that particular Hermione look, the one that checked whether you actually wanted to know or were just being polite. She concluded he wanted to know. "Fluffy," she said, quietly. Harry kept his face neutral. "The three-headed dog." She blinked. "You know about the three-headed dog? Third floor corridor, right door at the end of the left-hand side. The trapdoor in the floor. I noticed during the first week." He kept his voice low. "What about it?" Hermione stared at him. "Harry, when did you? I wanted to understand the layout of the castle," he said simply. "I walked all the corridors I had access to. Most are freely walkable. That one has a lock with a recent charm on it. The dog is visible through the keyhole." He paused. "What about it?" Hermione shook herself and refocused. "I've been looking into what it might be guarding. Given the timing, there was a break-in at Gringotts in July. A vault was emptied the same day Hagrid visited. And I found references to something called the Philosopher's Stone in 3 separate historical texts, and there was a note in the Daily Prophet archives from last spring about Nicholas Flamel, the alchemist," Harry said. "He made the stone. He and Dumbledore are old colleagues." He watched Hermione's expression shift through several things. "I found the same thread 2 weeks ago. The vault break-in, the timing, Flamel's name turning up in Dumbledore's history. I think the stone is here. Under the dog." Hermione sat very still for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "Why didn't you say anything?" "I was waiting to see where the thread went," Harry said. "And I didn't have enough yet. I still don't." He looked at the fire. "I think someone is trying to get to it. Someone inside the castle." "Inside, you mean a teacher?" "Possibly. Not Dumbledore." "No. Not Dumbledore." He thought about Quirrell, about the wrong smell and the strange absence and the hands touching the turban. "I'm still working it out." Hermione looked at him with an expression that was several things layered in quick succession: impressed, concerned, and underneath both of those, the slight shine of someone who has been working on a puzzle alone and has just found out they don't have to. "We should work on it together," she said. "Yes," he said. "Obviously." She pulled out a notebook. He pulled out his. Ron, from across the room, looked over from the chess game and assessed the situation with the instinct Harry had come to rely on. "Are we doing something important?" Ron said. "Possibly," Harry said. "Right." Ron conceded the chess game to Dean's complete bewilderment, stood up, and came over. "What do we know?" They worked until 11. Harry laid out what he had: Quirrell's behavior, the smell, the timing of the Gringotts break-in, the stone's probable location, and Hermione laid out what she'd found on the stone itself, its properties, what it would mean if someone got their hands on it. Ron listened and cross-referenced and asked the questions that sounded simple but weren't, the but who would actually benefit questions, the how does that work in practice questions, and the map of it became clearer. They didn't have enough. Harry knew they didn't have enough. You didn't walk up to a defense against the dark arts professor with a smell you couldn't identify and a theory built on library research and corridor observations and say I think something's wrong with you, not when you had no proof and the most powerful wizard in the world was 30 seconds away in his office and presumably had more information than they did. "Dumbledore knows the stone is here," Hermione said. He must. He arranged the protections. So either he doesn't know it's being targeted, or he does and he's handling it, or, Harry stopped. Or he knows and he's waiting, Ron said. Both Harry and Hermione looked at him. What? Ron said. I'm just saying. Dumbledore doesn't do anything without a reason. Maybe he knows someone's after it and he's letting them come so he can deal with it properly. Harry thought about Dumbledore in the hospital wing, that first day, sitting down. The man was comfortable with complex situations. The man was comfortable with waiting for things to play out. He thought about I am sorry, Harry and the comfortable interpretation of diagnostic data. He thought about how Dumbledore's plans had costs that Dumbledore was sometimes comfortable paying with other people's safety. Maybe, Harry said. But I'm not going to wait for Dumbledore's plan to have another cost. He looked at his notes. We keep watching. We build the evidence. And when we have enough, we act. Ron nodded. Hermione nodded. I want to know what's under that trapdoor, Harry said. Not to go down there, not yet. But knowing the layout of the protections would help us understand the timeline. If someone is systematically working through them, we'd see it, Hermione said. We'd see it, Harry confirmed. He gathered his notes and stretched and looked at the fire for a moment. He was tired in the good way, the used way, the way that comes from having spent your brain properly rather than just run it in circles. I'm going to bed, he said. Harry, Hermione said. He looked at her. The thing with the stone, that's a separate thing from the hearing. From everything that's been happening with, she stopped, then restarted with the precision she used when she wanted to be clear. You don't have to handle everything at once. You're allowed to just be here. Be a first year. Let things be normal occasionally. Harry looked at her. She was watching him with those brown eyes that had decided he was worth paying close attention to and had not changed their mind. I know, he said. I'm actually getting better at that. He thought about the toast, the library afternoon, the chess game. The problem is that the stone isn't going to wait for me to finish getting better at it. No, she said. Fair point. But thank you, he said. For saying it. She nodded. He went upstairs. The thing nobody had told Harry about learning to want things was that the learning wasn't smooth. It came in uneven intervals, with setbacks built in. The setback came on a Saturday. He woke up in the night from a dream he couldn't hold on to but which left a residue, something dark and small and enclosed, the smell of dusty carpet and the sound of footsteps going past above his head, the particular spatial awareness of a very small space. He lay in the dark dormitory and breathed through it, and it passed the way these things passed, not quickly but completely, leaving only the ordinary dark of a November night in Scotland with the wind pressing at the windows. He was not in the cupboard. He was in his bed, in Hogwarts, in a castle that had a three-headed dog on the third floor and a possible dark artifact below it and two friends 3 doors down. He was fine. He went through the facts methodically, the same way he'd go through inventory. He was fine. He didn't go back to sleep right away. He sat up in bed and wrapped the duvet around his shoulders and looked out the window at the dark grounds, the lake just visible as a different quality of dark, the mountains above it. The stars were partly obscured by cloud, moving fast. After a while he heard, from Dean Thomas's direction, the low sleepy mutter of a Quidditch dream. From Seamus Finnegan, slow breathing. From Neville, the peaceful sound of someone in deep, untroubled sleep. From Ron, an unconscious half-snore that had a character to it. Roy and all his brothers probably snored the same way, some inherited Weasley sound. Harry listened to all of it and found it comforting in a way that he thought said something important about what he'd been missing. Not the grand things. Not the significant things. Just the mundane sounds of other people being alive nearby. He settled back down and thought about the stone, running the evidence in the quiet way, sorting it without urgency, and somewhere in the middle of working out the likely sequencing of the protections he fell back asleep. In the morning he ate breakfast, a full one, 2 eggs and a piece of toast and porridge because he was hungry, and the hunger was a simple thing he could act on, and felt perfectly himself. November settled over the castle with the particular authority of Scottish autumn, the cold coming off the mountains with genuine conviction, the grounds going bronze and grey, the lake acquiring a texture that suggested it was seriously considering freezing. Harry had found, to his mild surprise, that he liked the cold. The Dursleys' house had always been slightly overwarm in the way of houses whose owners associated comfort with heat, and the brisk, uncomplicated cold of Hogwarts in November felt like being in honest weather. He'd started flying. This was Hermione's fault, in the most specific sense. She had been reviewing the Quidditch rulebook for reasons that were entirely typical of Hermione and had described several of the maneuvers with such technical precision that Harry had found himself genuinely curious whether he could do them, and curiosity in Harry had a way of becoming action. He'd borrowed a school broom on a Tuesday afternoon when the pitch was empty and gone out alone, which was technically not against the rules because formal flying lessons were done and the pitch was open for practice during free periods. He'd gone up, and that had been that. He wasn't performing the maneuvers from the rulebook. He was just flying. He went up high enough that Hogwarts below him looked like a model of itself, turrets and towers and the gleam of the lake, and he hung there in the cold air and let himself be entirely present in the feeling of it, the wind, the speed, the particular freedom of a space with no walls and no ceiling and nothing to manage except where he wanted to go. He found, up there, that he didn't think about anything. It was the only time that happened. McGonagall found him there on the third Tuesday, because McGonagall apparently watched the pitch for reasons of her own, and she stood on the ground below and watched him fly for 10 minutes before calling him down. He landed and braced for the reprimand and she said, "How long have you been flying?" 3 weeks, he said. On your own? Yes. You taught yourself, she said. There wasn't much to teach. It came, naturally. She was looking at him with the measuring expression. Harry. Are you familiar with the position of seeker? Yes, he said. Catches the snitch, ends the game, lightest and fastest flyer on the team. In 20 years of teaching Transfiguration, she said, I have seen one natural seeker. One. In 20 years. She looked at him. You are the second. Harry looked at the borrowed broom in his hands. He thought about it. He thought about the feeling of going up, the absence of thinking, the wind. Can I join the team? He said. I am going to make you an exception, McGonagall said, with the particular energy of someone who has already decided and is announcing it. You are the youngest seeker at Hogwarts in a century and I intend for Gryffindor to win the Quidditch Cup. What's the exception? First years don't normally play. You will. I'm writing to the headmaster this afternoon. She paused, and then added, with a warmth that was very deliberately deployed, your father was an exceptional chaser. Harry was quiet for a moment. Was he? One of the best I've seen. She said it simply and directly, the way she said things she meant. You might have got it from him. He held on to this piece of information about James Potter, one of the best she'd seen, and added it to the small collection. He was building a picture from fragments. He thought that was probably how you learned about dead parents. Fragment by fragment, from people who'd known them. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Win us the cup. She turned and walked back toward the castle with the decisive stride of a woman who has solved a problem. Harry looked at the pitch and the grey sky above it and then up at the castle looming warm against the cold, and he thought that wanting things was terrible and necessary and he was not going back. The letter from Arthur Weasley came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the hearing. It was a practical letter, covering the legal follow-up, the formal documentation of his ward status, the signed copy of the agreement that no placement at Privet Drive could be reinstated without his consent, the progress of the formal review of oversight protocols. Arthur wrote with the same quality he had in person, clear, warm, no unnecessary padding. He signed off with, Molly sends her love and wants you to know you are welcome at the Burrow for Christmas if Dumbledore approves the arrangement. No pressure whatsoever. She's already planning the menu just in case. Harry read the letter twice, folded it, and looked at the dormitory ceiling. Christmas at the Burrow. Ron had mentioned it once, briefly, in the way people mention things they'd like to happen but aren't sure they can ask for. A house full of Weasleys. How many brothers was it? 5 at Hogwarts plus 2 already out, and Molly Weasley who sent fudge and notes about sleeping properly. He was allowed to want that. He pulled out parchment and wrote back to Arthur, thanked him for the updates, said that he would very much like to accept the Christmas invitation if Dumbledore approved the arrangement, and that he would ask Dumbledore himself because it seemed more direct to do it that way. He sealed it and sent it with Hedwig, who took the letter with the authority of an owl who has decided her purpose is important, and Harry watched her go from the Ollery window into the grey morning sky. He thought about December. He thought about eating and sleeping and flying and the stone somewhere below the 3rd floor and Quirrell with his wrong smell and the castle around all of it, warm and impossible and real. He was learning to want things. He was getting better at it. The Quidditch practice that Thursday was his first, and Fred and George Weasley were so comprehensively pleased about it that the entire Gryffindor team seemed energized just from proximity to their enthusiasm. Oliver Wood, the captain, explained the seeker role with the intensity of someone for whom Quidditch was a genuine religious conviction, and Harry listened and nodded and then went up and demonstrated that he understood with a precision that made Oliver stop mid-sentence and stare. "Right," Oliver said, after a long pause. "Right, you're right." Fred and George exchanged a look. "We may actually win this year," George said. "We were going to win anyway," Fred said. "We were going to win this year in particular," George said. Harry came down from his first proper practice with cold cheeks and wind-stung eyes and the clean, particular tiredness that was entirely different from the tiredness of managing a threat, and he was already thinking about the next one. He was also thinking about the snitch. He hadn't caught one today. Oliver had used a practice model that was slightly slower than regulation, but he'd had it in his peripheral vision 3 times and had calculated its trajectory twice before redirecting. He thought he understood it. He thought he understood the way it thought, if you could say a charmed ball thought. It was evasion over speed. It wanted to be not caught more than it wanted to go anywhere in particular. If you chased it directly you'd never catch it. You had to anticipate. Harry knew a great deal about anticipating evasion. He went into the changing rooms and pulled off his gloves and sat on the bench for a moment in the quiet. Outside he could hear Fred and George arguing about something with the cheerful energy of 2 people who argue for the joy of it. Oliver was already reviewing his notes for next week's tactics. He was on the Quidditch team. He was a ward of the Wizarding State in the most permanently documented sense. He was going to spend Christmas at the Burrow. He was in the middle of a problem involving a stone that could grant immortality and a teacher who was not quite what he appeared. He was 11 years old and his life had a texture it hadn't had before, a rich, complicated, occasionally frightening texture that was not the texture of managing and surviving. It was the texture of living. Specifically and completely living. He stood up, pulled his gloves back on against the cold, and went back to the castle. The evening was already coming in over the mountains. The first stars were appearing above the lake. Somewhere inside, his friends were waiting. He walked quickly. Chapter 5, The Stone Beneath Everything. The smell got worse in December. Harry had been tracking it since September, the particular wrongness that clung to Quirrell in defense lessons, in corridors, in the brief moments when they passed each other at mealtimes. It had been faint at first, something at the edge of perception, the kind of thing your brain registers and then files under not immediately relevant. By the first week of December it was no longer at the edge of anything. It was present and specific, and Harry had, after 3 weeks of library research and 2 conversations with Hermione in hushed voices over reference texts, put a name to part of it. Dark magic had a smell. Not all of it, not always, but the older kinds, the sustained kinds, the kinds that required a living host or a binding sacrifice or a prolonged presence in something not meant to contain them, left a trace. The books called it residual malefic resonance, which was the sort of phrase that existed to give something unnameable a handle. What it smelled like, specifically, was old stone and something underneath it that wasn't stone, something biological and wrong, like the moment just before meat spoiled. Harry knew what rotting meat smelled like. He had cleaned the Dursleys' refrigerator since he was 5. "It's not just Quirrell," Hermione said, on a Wednesday evening in the library's back corner, her voice low. She had 3 books open and her notes spread in a fan around her, which was her natural habitat. "Or, it is Quirrell, but it's not coming from Quirrell. I think it's coming through him." Harry looked at what she'd marked in the text in front of her. A passage about corporeal possession, the magical and physical effects on a host body when a non-corporeal entity occupied it, the signs, the timeline, the degradation. He read it. He read it twice. "How long can a possessed host sustain it?" he asked. "It depends on the strength of both parties. A strong witch or wizard can maintain it longer." "But," Hermione tapped a paragraph. "There are limits. The host degrades. The entity needs a more permanent solution." "The stone," Harry said. "The stone," she said. If it's Voldemort, using Quirrell, he's been in there since at least the start of term. Maybe longer. He needs the stone to get a body back before Quirrell stops being usable," Harry finished. They looked at each other across the table. "Have you told Dumbledore?" Ron said. He'd been listening with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands, doing the thing where he appeared to be barely engaged and was actually tracking every word. "I want more before I go to Dumbledore," Harry said. "Harry." Ron looked at him directly. "Mate. You think Voldemort is literally inside your defense teacher? I feel like that's enough." "What I think isn't evidence," Harry said. "And Dumbledore," he stopped, choosing his words. "Dumbledore has a plan for everything. If I go to him now, with a theory and a smell and some library research, he's going to nod and tell me he has it handled and send me back to my dormitory. And then the next part of this plays out according to his plan, not ours." "Maybe his plan is fine," Ron said. "His plans have costs," Harry said. "I want to understand what we're dealing with before I hand it to someone else's plan." Ron processed this. He had a very honest face, Ron did, it showed his thinking in real time. "Okay," he said. "But we're telling him before anything actually happens." "Yes?" "Yes," Harry said. "Absolutely yes." Hermione was already writing something. "I want to map the protections under the trapdoor. Not go through them, map them. If we know what they are and what order they're in, we can estimate how far along someone is in working through them. We can track progress." She looked up. "If the protections start being triggered or dismantled, we'll know immediately." "How do we know what the protections are?" Ron asked. "Some of them are public knowledge," Hermione said. "Dumbledore would have enlisted the most skilled teachers. Quirrell himself was probably one of them, which is," she stopped. "That's horrifying, actually. He knows exactly what he put in place. He bypasses his own protection," Harry said. "The others he'd have to work through. So we're looking for signs of the remaining teachers' protections being disrupted." He thought about the staff. Sprout. Flitwick. McGonagall. Probably Snape. Snape? Ron looked alarmed. "Snape is one of the most accomplished wizards at this school," Harry said. "Of course Dumbledore used him." He paused. "Snape is not working for Voldemort." "How are you sure?" "Because he offered to testify for me in October," Harry said. "And because I've been watching him watch Quirrell for 2 months, and whatever Snape is, he's not a man who makes peace with what Quirrell has become." Hermione and Ron exchanged the particular look they exchanged when Harry said something that was 3 logical steps ahead of where they were standing. Right, Ron said. So we watch for disruption in the other protections. And we move carefully, Harry said. And we tell Dumbledore the moment anything actually moves. And in the meantime, Hermione said, with a sudden practical energy, we have Christmas approaching and we should probably think about that rather than Voldemort's gradual physical reconstruction for at least some of each day. That's very reasonable, Harry agreed. I'm deeply reassured, Ron said. He went to Dumbledore's office the following week about Christmas. The gargoyle remembered him and stepped aside before he gave the password. Harry noted this with mild interest and went up the spiral staircase, which had by now acquired the quality of a familiar thing rather than an impressive one. Dumbledore was at his desk writing and looked up when Harry came in with the expression of a man who is pleased to be interrupted by a particular person. Harry. Come in. Tea? No thank you. Harry sat. I've had a letter from Arthur Weasley. His wife has invited me to stay at their home for Christmas. I wanted to ask your permission directly. You could have sent a note, Dumbledore said, not unkindly. I could have, Harry said. But I also wanted to talk to you. Ah. Dumbledore set his quill down and gave Harry his full attention. Then talk. Harry considered his opening. He had 2 things to address and the order mattered. He chose the personal one first, which surprised him as he chose it, evidence of the thing he'd been working on, the hierarchy shifting, feeling sometimes moving ahead of strategy. Christmas at the Burrow, he said. I want to go. I want you to know I want to go, not just that I'm asking permission for it. Dumbledore's expression was the warm kind, the genuinely warm kind rather than the performed kind. Of course you may go. Thank you. Harry paused. And the blood protection, you said in September that without Privet Drive as my home we'd need to discuss alternatives. The hearing made Privet Drive permanent past, not just past. What's the actual exposure? What are the active threats I should understand? Dumbledore studied him for a moment. You're asking me to brief you. Yes. A pause. Then Dumbledore said, carefully, there are individuals who were loyal to Voldemort during the war and who would consider you a priority target if he were to return to power. His power base was broken in 1981 and has not reformed. The primary threat is not imminent attack so much as, he stopped. Restarted. There are channels of information within the Death Eater community that remain active. Your location and circumstances are of interest to them. The blood protection at Privet Drive served to obscure that information as much as to shield against direct magical attack. So the threat is intelligence-based more than active. At present. Yes. Harry thought about this. He thought about the smell in the defense classroom and the degrading host and the stone below the 3rd floor. He thought about at present. And if something changed that, Harry said carefully. If Voldemort's situation changed. If he were closer to returning than currently assessed. What would the threat level look like then? Dumbledore was very still. The instruments on his desk continued their murmuring rotations. The phoenix shifted on its perch with a sound like expensive silk. Harry, Dumbledore said. What do you know? And Harry had decided, somewhere between the library on Wednesday and this chair on Monday, that he was done holding this one. He'd built the map. He'd done the work. And Ron was right that there was a level of information at which I want more before I tell Dumbledore stopped being strategy and started being a liability. I think Quirrell is possessed, Harry said. By Voldemort. I think it's been happening since before the start of term. I think the Gringotts break-in in July was Voldemort looking for the stone that is currently underneath our school, and I think he's working through the protections, through Quirrell, who designed one of them and therefore bypasses it, and I think the timeline is accelerating because a possessed host has a physical shelf life and Quirrell's is running out. The silence that followed had a very specific quality. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long time. The blue eyes were not performing anything right now. They were just present, and what was in them was a complex layering that Harry read as, "I know some of this. I suspected more. I did not expect to have it laid out by an 11-year-old with this degree of completeness." "How long have you been building this?" Dumbledore asked. "Since October." The smell was the first indicator. Hermione identified the possession signatures from the library texts. Ron found the pattern in Quirrell's teaching degradation. He's been losing coherence. That's accelerating. You discussed this with Granger and Weasley. They're part of it, Harry said. They know everything I know. That was a decision I made deliberately. I see. Dumbledore was quiet. The Phoenix sang a single low note. Harry. You are correct about Quirrell. You are substantially correct about the stone. And you are correct that the timeline is not comfortable. So it's actually happening, Harry said. It has been happening. I have been managing it. He said this last part with the quality of a man who knows he is about to be asked something he'd prefer not to answer. Managing it how? Harry asked. What's the plan? Dumbledore said, the protections are layered precisely to ensure that no single person, even one with inside knowledge, can reach the stone alone. Even if Quirrell works through each layer, the final protection requires something he cannot possess. What does it require? A person who desires the stone but does not wish to use it. He paused. A person who wants it for others, not for themselves. Harry sat with this. That's actually elegant, he said. Thank you. It is my protection. But it means the plan is, let him get to the final chamber and then he hits that wall? Harry looked at Dumbledore directly. And then what? He doesn't just stop. If Quirrell reaches the stone and is stopped by the last protection, there's a confrontation. Voldemort, whatever form he has, doesn't simply go away. There's a resolution required. Yes, Dumbledore said. What is the resolution? A pause. In all likelihood, Dumbledore said, very quietly, the resolution involves you. Harry had been half expecting this. He had thought about it as one possible answer, the one that made the most complete story, the boy who survived in 1981, the scar, the particular history. He had been waiting to see if Dumbledore would tell him directly or arrange for him to find out through the plot. Dumbledore had chosen direct. Harry gave him credit for that. Why me? He said. Your mother's sacrifice created a protection in your blood that Voldemort cannot touch without being destroyed. It is the same mechanism that stopped him in 1981. If he is confronted in a state of partial existence, without a body, attached to a failing host, touching you would be catastrophic for him. He paused. I had hoped this confrontation might not be necessary this year. I had hoped to manage the situation until a time when you were older and more prepared. But the timeline is accelerating, Harry said. Yes. Because of the hearing, Harry said. Not accusingly. Because when the hearing happened, I stopped going back to Privet Drive. The blood protection that was being maintained by my presence there, Voldemort would have felt that change. It would have accelerated his timeline. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. That is, a sophisticated analysis. Is it correct? In part, Dumbledore said. Possibly in larger part than I'd like to admit. Harry thought about this. He thought about all the ways things connected, 64 healing charms leading to a hearing leading to the permanent dissolution of the Privet Drive protection leading to Voldemort accelerating his timeline leading to a confrontation that was now possibly happening this year rather than at some comfortably distant future point. He thought about the way Dumbledore's plans had costs. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was not angry about it. Okay, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. Okay? I'm not going to pretend the connection doesn't exist. But I also chose to pursue the hearing. Knowing the blood protection was involved. I knew there would be consequences to changing my living situation, and I weighed them against the benefit, and I made a choice. He met the blue eyes. That was my choice. I don't regret it. And I'm not going to spend time being angry about a consequence I accepted when I made the decision. Harry, Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice that had the quality of a man who has been carrying a weight and has found, unexpectedly, that part of it has been lifted. You are quite extraordinary. I'm practical, Harry said. Can we talk about what actually happens when Quirrell moves? They talked for an hour. The week before Christmas had a particular quality, a loosening, a lightening, the castle releasing some of its formal structure as students began disappearing toward home in groups. The corridors got quieter and the great hall got smaller, and the general atmosphere shifted toward something that felt more like living inside a house than inside an institution. Harry had told Hermione and Ron the full conversation with Dumbledore. He told them the way he told them everything, completely, in the library's back corner, with the door visible. He told them about the confrontation being likely, about the blood protection, about his own role in potentially accelerating the timeline. Ron said, "So it might happen this year." "It might happen this year," Harry confirmed. "Right." Ron cracked his knuckles. "Well. We're ready." "Ron," Hermione started. "We've been watching since October," Ron said. "We've mapped the protections, we know the layout, we understand the timeline better than Dumbledore expected us to. We're ready." He looked at Harry. "You're not going down there alone." "I wasn't planning to," Harry said. "Good." Ron leaned back. "Because I have actually thought about which of the protections I could handle, and I'm fairly confident about the chess one." Both Harry and Hermione stared at him. "There's a chess protection?" Hermione said. "There's going to be," Ron said, with the serenity of someone who has done their own private analysis and is comfortable with where it led. "Whatever Dumbledore's best teachers put down there, someone put a logic puzzle. And whatever the others are, you two handle those, there will be a chess board." "I know it." Harry looked at him. "How do you know it?" "I don't," Ron said cheerfully. "But if I were designing a protection that required a particular skill to get through, I'd do chess. And if there is one, I've got it." He looked at Harry. "And whatever the last bit is, the one Dumbledore said stops Quirrell, that's yours." "Yes," Harry said. "Right. So we have a plan." "We have the outline of a plan," Hermione said, with some precision. "That's most of a plan," Ron said. Harry looked between them, Ron's easy confidence and Hermione's exacting precision, and thought that these two things together were, in some essential way, what he'd been missing for 11 years. Not just friendship. A particular kind of complementarity. Three people who each brought something the others didn't have. "Merry almost Christmas," he said. Ron grinned. Hermione almost smiled, which from Hermione in a planning session was essentially a full laugh. Christmas at the Burrow was everything the Burrow implied it would be and more. The house was enchanted in a way that Harry associated with something being genuinely loved. It shouldn't have held together by any architectural logic, rooms stacked on rooms, additions built at angles that suggested enthusiasm over planning, everything slightly worn and bright with use. It smelled like cooking and wood smoke, and the particular smell of a house where too many people lived comfortably. Molly Weasley opened the door before they'd knocked and embraced Harry in a way that was entirely without prior discussion or permission and was, he found, not uncomfortable. He was surprised by this. He had a reflexive avoidance of physical contact from adults that had been, practical, for 10 years. Molly Weasley's hug had the quality of something he hadn't known he was missing until it happened. He stood in it for approximately 3 seconds before she released him and immediately began directing him toward the kitchen table. "You're too thin," she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone diagnosing a fixable problem. "Ron said you've been eating properly at school, but I want to see it in action." "Sit down." "Hello, Mrs. Weasley," Harry said. "Call me Molly," she said. Sit. There's soup. He sat. There was soup. It was the best thing he had eaten in his life, which had been a high bar since arriving at Hogwarts, and he said so, and Molly Weasley looked at him with her warm, fierce eyes and said, "You'll have more, then," and he did. Arthur sat across from him and they talked about the legal follow-up. The formal review was progressing, the oversight protocol revisions were in committee, the Dursleys' formal caution had been served and logged, and then they talked about nothing in particular, about Muggle things Arthur found fascinating, about Quidditch, about the castle. Fred and George appeared at intervals and treated Harry immediately as an equal member of their particular kind of chaos, which was the highest compliment they had. Ron sat beside him and looked quietly pleased in the way of someone whose two worlds have made successful contact. On Christmas morning there were presents under the tree that had put itself up in the corner of the sitting room with the casual magic of a house that handled such things without fuss. Harry had a small stack. A book from Hermione, who had old it ahead. A chess set from Ron with a note that said for practice, "Though I'll still beat you." Something from Fred and George that turned out to be a collection of their experimental sweets with a label warning him sternly not to give them to McGonagall, which suggested that they had already tried this. From Molly Weasley, a jumper. Green, hand-knitted, with a small golden H worked into the front. Harry held it for a long moment. He held it the way you hold something that is simple and completely enormous at the same time. It was wool and warmth and someone's hands had made it specifically for him, had known his name and his house color and the initial that was his, and had made something with those hands and sent it. It was not expensive. It was not grand. It was the most significant object he had been given in 11 years. He put it on over his pajamas and wore it all of Christmas Day. Molly noticed and said nothing, which was the right choice, and Ron noticed and also said nothing, which was also the right choice, and Arthur smiled at Harry across the breakfast table with the look of a man who is quietly satisfied with how something has turned out. Harry ate Christmas breakfast and wore a green jumper with his initial on it and thought that this specifically, this warm chaotic house with its stacked impossible rooms and its cooking and its entirely too many Weasleys, this was what he'd been learning to want. He had it now. They were back at Hogwarts 3 days before term started, returning early because Harry had wanted to and Hermione had wanted to and Ron had come along because going back early was better than waiting in a house where Percy had started preparing for his OWL essays 3 years in advance, which Ron described as genuinely oppressive to live with. The castle was quiet in the way it only was when most of its people were gone, not empty, but resting, the deep sound of it more audible without the constant overlay of hundreds of students. Harry walked the corridors with something approaching ease. He knew this place. He knew its rhythms and its geography and its particular personality, the way it shifted and resettled, the staircases that were moods rather than directions. He knew it the way he'd once known Privet Drive, except that knowing the Dursleys' house had been necessary and knowing Hogwarts was a choice, and those were completely different things. On the second evening back, Harry was in the third-floor corridor. Not at the locked door. Not even near it. He was passing through on his way somewhere else when he stopped, not because anything had changed visibly but because something had changed in the air, a quality of disruption, very slight, the particular disturbance of recently used magic in a space. He stood in the corridor and was very still and catalogued it. He had been tracking the baseline magical atmosphere of this corridor for 2 months. He knew what it felt like on an ordinary day. He knew the particular signature of the lock charm on the door. He knew the baseline smell. This was not the baseline. He went back to the dormitory. He got Ron and Hermione, who were both awake because they were both the kind of people who were awake late when the castle was quiet. He brought them to the corridor. Hermione read the air with 3 quick diagnostic charms. She'd practiced these in secret for exactly this reason, and turned to Harry with an expression that had gone from assessment to urgency. "Someone's been in here," she said. "The lock's been resealed but it was opened less than an hour ago." Harry looked at the door. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the timing, 3 days before the start of term, the castle at its quietest, most of the staff absent. The clock in whatever version of this plan he'd been tracking had moved to a new position. "It's starting," he said. Not with fear. With the focused, contained energy of someone whose preparation is about to become action. "Dumbledore," Hermione said immediately. "Yes," Harry said. "We go to Dumbledore right now." He looked at both of them. "Together. All three of us, everything we know, clearly laid out." He was already moving. "Come on." They went fast through the quiet castle, up staircases, through corridors, the portraits watching them go with the interested attention of people who observe a lot of history and know when something is happening. The gargoyle at the third-floor entrance was asleep, which it wasn't supposed to be, which was itself a sign of something having been done to the castle's alert systems. Harry stopped. He looked at the gargoyle. He looked at Hermione. She ran a quick charm and her expression confirmed it. "The gargoyle's been suppressed," she said. "The alert system to Dumbledore's office, it's been dampened." She looked at Harry. Someone didn't want him to know when the corridor was opened. "Quirrell," Harry said. He'd know the alert protocols. He helped build them. He thought fast. "Can you undo it?" "I think so," Hermione said. "Give me a minute." She worked on it with the concentrated precision that was her best self, wand movements exact, the countercharm applied in 2 stages, the gargoyle stirring back to alertness with the slightly confused air of something that doesn't know it's been asleep. She stepped back and looked at Harry. "Done," she said. "Dumbledore's office system should be live again. Will he know someone's been in the corridor? He'll see it now in whatever his monitoring shows." "Good. Then we go and tell him directly in case the monitoring isn't enough." Harry turned back toward the staircases and paused. He stood in the corridor and considered the door. The door to the third-floor corridor was to his right. The staircase up to Dumbledore's office was ahead and above. He had just told Dumbledore everything. He had made the plan, tell Dumbledore before anything actually happens. The thing had not yet happened. Someone had accessed the corridor once, which was the first movement in the sequence, but the stone was still where it was and Quirrell was presumably somewhere in the castle and the confrontation, if it came, was not tonight. He went up the stairs. He went directly, unhesitatingly, upward and toward Dumbledore's office and he did not look back at the third-floor door, because he had made a decision and the decision was to tell someone and the plan existed for a reason and he was going to follow it. The gargoyle at Dumbledore's office was also not quite right, the same dampening charm, slightly less effectively applied. Hermione fixed it in 30 seconds, and when Harry knocked on the door he knocked with the solid knock of someone who knows they have information that cannot wait. There was no answer. Harry knocked again. Nothing. He tried the handle. The door opened. He went in and the office was empty, not casually empty, empty in the specific way of a space from which someone has departed recently. The fire was low, the desk arranged as though work had been paused. The phoenix sat on its perch and looked at Harry with its copper eyes and made a sound that was not its usual song. Something more urgent. "He's gone," Ron said. "He knew," Harry said. He thought about it, walking through the logic. He knew something was moving tonight. He left before the alert system was fully suppressed, he saw partial movement and acted on it. He's gone somewhere. He thought about Dumbledore's plan. About the final protection, about what it required. He's gone to respond to something that's drawing him away. Someone sent for him. They got him out of the castle, Hermione said slowly. Before going for the stone. Yes. Harry looked at the fire. He looked at the phoenix. He looked at his friends. He thought about the planning they'd done, the 3 of them in the library's back corner, over 2 months of quiet systematic work, building the map of exactly this. He thought about Ron's certainty about the chess board. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" Ron said. "We go," Harry said. "We go now, we get to the stone, and we stop whatever's happening in there until Dumbledore gets back." He looked at both of them steadily. "I am not standing in a corridor while this plays out without us. We know the protections. We've prepared for exactly this. And the final protection," he looked at his own hands for a moment. "I'm the right person for it. Literally. I was built for the specific last step." He looked up. "But I need you both for everything before it." Hermione had gone through several expressions rapidly and arrived at one that was determined and clear-eyed and not afraid. "I know the potions logic puzzle," she said. "From Snape's section. I worked it out from the library description of his typical assessment methodology." "I knew it," Ron said, with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with bragging and everything to do with a man who had been right about himself. "And I know the chess board. If there is one. There will be," Harry said. He said it with the certainty of someone who trusts the people they're working with. "Let's go." They left Dumbledore's empty office and went back down through the quiet castle, and the portraits watched them with expressions that suggested they had seen many important moments and were paying close attention to this one, and the staircases moved to let them through as though the castle had decided to cooperate with what was happening. At the third-floor door Harry paused. He took one breath, the habit, the inventory, the old practice of arriving fully into the moment before you moved into the unknown. He had done this 10 years ago before coming downstairs at Privet Drive, and he was doing it now before going through a door with his friends into whatever was below. It was, he thought, the same gesture in completely different circumstances. He opened the door. Fluffy was asleep. Something was playing, a small enchanted harp, almost silent, a charmed sleep already in progress. Harry noted this with the part of his brain that catalogued everything and felt a cold clarity descend, the particular mental state he'd learned to access in years of needing to be sharp. Someone had just come through this way. They were still ahead. The trapdoor was open. He looked at Ron and Hermione. Hermione nodded. Ron cracked his knuckles once. They dropped down. The protections came in sequence, each one distinct, each one carrying the personality of whoever had made it. The devil's snare was Sprouts and Hermione handled it without breaking stride, speaking calmly about the light while Ron made a noise of genuine alarm and Harry used the lumos at full brightness and the plant recoiled with the speed of something that has run out of options. The flying keys were Flitwick's, a vast, wheeling, enchanted mass of them in the dark, all shapes and all sizes, one of them the right one and all of them aware enough to scatter when approached. Harry got on the broom waiting below them and went up and the chaos of it fell away because in here, in the air, this was the thing he could do without thinking. He read the movement patterns of the keys with the same instinct he used for snitches, the one that was different would fly differently, would move with a damaged quality, wing bent, the wear of having already been used. He found it in 40 seconds, went for it in a dive that made Ron shout something from below, caught it, came down. Ron took one look at the chess board and said, yes, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been waiting. It was a full-sized wizarding chess board, pieces towering over them, the board spanning the entire chamber. The scale of it was different in reality than Harry had imagined, the pieces were enormous and they moved with the weight of things that knew their purpose. "I need to think," Ron said, and sat down in front of it, and looked at it with a stillness Harry recognized from their evenings in the common room. When Ron played chess, he was entirely present in it. Everything else dropped away. Ron played. He played as himself, which was the only way he knew how, and he played as though he understood that this was a board that responded to genuine skill rather than cleverness, that it was built to reward the person who was exactly what chess required, and Ron was exactly what chess required. He moved with authority. He spoke to his pieces with the confidence of someone they'd follow. The other side's pieces moved with the precision of a challenge built by someone who knew the game. 12 minutes. Ron found the line and ran it to its end, and at the end there was a sacrifice, and Harry watched Ron calculate it without flinching and make it cleanly, and the White Queen demolished his piece with a force that made the stone floor shake, and the path opened. That's it, Ron said, standing. He looked slightly pale. Go. I'll wait here. Ron, Harry. Ron looked at him directly. I've got this chamber. This is what I'm here for. You've got the next part. He paused. Both of you go. Harry held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way you nod when something is right and you don't need to make more of it than it is. They went. Snape's protection was a riddle built around 7 bottles, a passage of fire, a logic problem of the kind that worked from true premises and rewarded patience and clarity. Hermione read the verses on the wall and went still with the absolute concentration of someone reading something in their native language. Harry watched the fire behind them. He watched the fire ahead. He watched Hermione think. 3 minutes. This one, she said, pointing to a small glass bottle on the left. For the fire ahead. There's only enough for one person to go through safely. Harry looked at the bottle. He looked at the fire ahead and the fire behind. He did the maths. Go back, Harry said. Hermione looked at him. The fire behind, the ice-cold bottle, yes? That's for going back. He held her gaze. Go back and get Ron and get out. Get a teacher, get Snape, actually, he's the right person. Send someone to find Dumbledore. Tell them everything. He took the small bottle from the row. I can handle what's ahead. Harry, Hermione. He said it quietly and with complete certainty, not pushing her away but landing the reality of the situation. You know I'm the only one who can do the last part. Whatever's in that next chamber, the final protection is mine. I need you and Ron out and finding help because whatever happens in there, someone needs to know where I am. She processed this with the speed she processed everything, the full run of it visible in her face, the argument she wanted to make, the logic overcoming it, the fear and the trust landing in the same place. She took the ice-cold bottle from the row. Be careful, she said. I'm always careful, he said. You dropped through a trapdoor with me 20 minutes ago, she said, and it was almost a laugh, and she drank the bottle and walked backward through the black flames and was gone. Harry stood alone in the small chamber between the fires with the tiny bottle in his hand. He was 11 years old. He was in the lowest point of Hogwarts, beneath 3 separate enchantments, with a possessed teacher somewhere ahead of him and a Dark Lord's partial existence in the chamber beyond. He drank the bottle. The cold was extraordinary, like swallowing winter, like his whole body had been clarified, and then the fire ahead parted and he walked through and into what was on the other side. The last chamber was the largest, its ceiling lost in the dark above, and it smelled like the worst version of what the defense classroom had smelled like all term, concentrated and old and wrong. In the center of the room, before a large ornate mirror that Harry recognized immediately from Dumbledore's description in their conversation, stood Professor Quirrell. He was staring into the mirror. His hands were pressed flat against the frame. He was trembling with a fine, continuous shiver, and in the candlelight of the chamber his face looked wrong in the way faces look when something else has been living in them too long. He turned when Harry entered. Potter, he said, and the stutter was gone. I was wondering when you'd arrive. Harry looked at him and looked at the mirror and looked at the chamber with the whole, gathered attention of someone who has been preparing for exactly this conversation for 2 months. Professor, he said. Don't. Quirrell smiled, and it was the smile of a man wearing a face that no longer quite fit. We're past that, I think. You've known something was wrong since October. You're very observant. A pause. Unnervingly so, for someone your age. I've had practice, Harry said. Quirrell turned slightly back to the mirror. The stone is in there. I can see it. But I can't. His voice shifted for a moment, a flicker of frustration. I can't reach it. The mirror only shows it to someone who wants it but won't use it. He looked at Harry. Which is an infuriating protection. I know, Harry said. Dumbledore told me. He watched Quirrell's face shift at the mention of Dumbledore, something tightening. He designed it specifically. Come here, Quirrell said. No, Harry said. A pause. Something changed in the room. You should be afraid, Quirrell said. I've heard that before, Harry said. From people with a worse track record for backing it up than you. He stood comfortably in the chamber and looked at the mirror and thought about what he knew and what it meant. You need me to stand in front of the mirror. Because what you need isn't the stone, it's to see the stone through someone else, someone who genuinely doesn't want to use it. He paused. I'm the only person who fits that protection exactly. Very good, Quirrell said. Something happened in his voice, a layering, a quality underneath it that wasn't Quirrell at all, deeper and colder. Then you understand why you have no choice. I understand why you think I have no choice, Harry said. He was looking at the mirror now, at the reflection of the chamber, at his own figure reflected back. I'm going to stand here. And I'm going to look. And what I see is going to be what I see, which will be different from what you see. He moved to stand before the mirror and felt the cold of Snape's protection still moving through him, clarity and winter in his blood. Because I genuinely don't want it. He looked into the mirror. His reflection looked back at him. In the mirror's image, his reflection reached into its pocket and drew out a brilliant red stone that caught the light like a living thing, and winked at him, and put it back. He felt something drop into his pocket. Something real. Something small and warm. He had it. He had it in his hand and he had not reached for it or tried for it or wanted it in any selfish sense, and the mirror had given it to him anyway, with the logic of a protection designed by someone who understood exactly the kind of person Harry Potter had been made into by 10 years of wanting nothing for himself. He closed his fingers around it. Quirrell's eyes had been on the mirror. He'd seen. He moved toward Harry with a speed that was not Quirrell's speed, something else moving through him, driving the body harder than it would naturally go, and Harry stepped back and thought about what Dumbledore had told him. Touching you would be catastrophic for him. He thought about the blood protection. He thought about 64 healing charms and what they'd cost and what they'd built in him, the strange alchemy of surviving something for long enough that the survival itself became power. Quirrell's hands closed on his arm. The scream was immediate. It was Quirrell who screamed, his hands where they touched Harry's skin blistering and burning in seconds, and the burn spreading, the possession meeting the protection in Harry's blood, and the collision between them was physical, was real, was happening in the stone and smoke smell of the chamber. Quirrell fell back and his face was changing, and there was something else beneath it, something that looked at Harry with red eyes that Harry met without flinching. You, it said. The voice was nothing like Quirrell's. Yes, Harry said. It came at him again. Desperation, the animal urgency of something that is running out of options, that has spent months in a failing host and can feel the window closing. Harry stood his ground and the stone was in his closed fist and the voice was screaming something he couldn't make out, and Quirrell's hands reached for him and Harry let them because Dumbledore had told him and he understood the mechanism and he trusted the logic of his mother's sacrifice the same way he trusted anything that had been tested. The burning spread up Quirrell's arms. The screaming rose. Harry held on because the longer he held on the less of this there was to resolve later, the more completely this particular iteration ended here. He was aware of something detaching from Quirrell's ruined form, something cold and shrieking, passing through him like ice water, and then darkness came up fast from the floor and he went down into it. He woke up later. He didn't know how much later. He was in the hospital wing, which he recognized from the smell and the light and the quality of the bed, and Dumbledore was sitting in the chair beside him. "The stone?" Harry said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. "Destroyed," Dumbledore said. "I was persuaded, some time ago, that its continued existence served no good purpose. It will not be an object of pursuit again." Harry looked at the ceiling. "Quirrell?" "Gone," Dumbledore said quietly. Harry held that. He didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt tired, and clear, and very present in the specific way you feel present when you have been recently unconscious. He turned his head and looked at Dumbledore, who was watching him with the blue eyes that were currently doing the complicated layered thing, the pride and the guilt and the genuine warmth all present at once. How long was I out? 3 days. Hermione and Ron? Both unharmed. Both extremely persistent in their demand to know when you would wake up. They have been taking shifts in the corridor. Dumbledore's eyes did something that was definitely the full twinkle. Mr. Weasley brought a chessboard. Harry let out a slow breath. He thought about Ron sitting outside with a chessboard for 3 days and found the thought did something warm to his chest. Voldemort, he said. Gone. Not destroyed, I believe that is not yet possible. But gone. Without a body, without the stone, without a host. He will be, somewhere, diminished, for some time. Dumbledore looked at him steadily. This is not over. I want to be honest with you about that. This was a chapter, not a conclusion. I know, Harry said. He had known. I'm not a conclusion, he said. I'm a first year. He looked at Dumbledore. I'm a first year who has had a very full term. An understatement of some quality, Dumbledore said. What happens now? Harry said. Summer. Guardianship. Everything. The Weasleys have formally requested extended summer guardianship, Dumbledore said. Arthur and Molly filed the paperwork last week. It is, in my opinion, an excellent arrangement, and I have approved it. He paused. Provided you wish it. Harry thought about a green jumper with an H on it. About soup. About Molly Weasley's hug and Arthur's quiet warmth and a house that shouldn't hold together but did. Yes, he said. I wish it. Dumbledore nodded. There was a quality of rightness to the nod, something settling into place that had been trying to settle for a long time. Then it's arranged, Dumbledore said. Rest now. Harry looked at the ceiling of the hospital wing. He could hear, faintly, from the corridor, voices. Low and familiar. Ron saying something, Hermione responding, the particular rhythm of two people who have been sitting together waiting for a long time and have run out of things to argue about and have moved into comfortable silence interrupted by the occasional observation. He closed his eyes. He was alive. The stone was gone. Voldemort was a problem for a future year, and he would deal with it in a future year, with the same approach he'd brought to everything else, preparation, attention, the people beside him who had already proved themselves in exactly the ways that mattered. He was a first year. He had passed something today that couldn't be measured in OWLS. He slept. Chapter 6, What Survives the Last Week of Term arrived with the energy of something that had been held at high tension for a very long time releasing all at once. Harry was discharged from the hospital wing on a Tuesday, 4 days before the end-of-year feast, 3 days before the Hogwarts Express took everyone home. Pomfrey had kept him an extra day beyond what was strictly medical. He suspected she'd done this deliberately, creating a buffer between the stone chamber and the world, and he didn't object to it. The hospital wing had acquired, in the past 9 months, a quality that was not quite comfort but was something close, a space where things were allowed to be acknowledged without being performed. He sat on the edge of the examination bed while she ran a final diagnostic and thought about the fact that the last time he'd sat in this position the diagnostic had returned 64 results and changed everything. This one returned clean. He was in good health, magically and physically. She noted this on her clipboard with the particular satisfaction of a result she had worked toward. "You're cleared," she said. "Thank you, Madame Pomfrey," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those sharp, honest eyes. Then she did something she had not done in all the clinical, efficient interactions of the past 9 months. She sat down in the chair beside the bed, the one usually occupied by visitors, and looked at him directly and said, "How are you, Harry?" Not medically. He considered the question with the seriousness she was offering it. "I'm good," he said. And then, because she deserved the complete version, "I'm genuinely good. Not the managing the situation good. Actually good." She held his gaze for a moment. "The stone," she said. "The hearing. The whole of it, this year." She paused. "That is an enormous amount for anyone to carry in 9 months. I didn't carry it alone," he said. He thought about this as he said it and recognized it was true, and that recognizing it was true was itself new. He had spent a decade carrying things alone because alone was what he had. This year he had not been alone, and the difference was not small. Ron and Hermione were there for the stone. Arthur and you were there for the hearing. McGonagall. Even Snape, in his way. He looked at her. "You were the first one." She made a small sound that was not quite a word. "You were the first adult who saw the diagnostic and didn't make it about the situation instead of about me," he said. "You asked me what I knew. You gave me a copy of my own records. You treated me like someone capable of handling information about myself." He met her eyes. That mattered. Pomfrey was quiet for a long moment. The hospital wing breathed around them, the high windows giving the particular late June light that made everything look like it was ending and beginning at the same time. "You were 3 years old the first time," she said. Not as a question. Just as something she was placing on the table between them, because she'd been carrying it too. "Yes," Harry said. "I wish I had." She stopped. "When the board implemented the mandatory screening, I'd been advocating for it for 6 years. Voluntary screenings had always been available but rarely used. The stigma of seeking help in this world, the fear of ministry involvement, families avoided them." She paused. 6 years. "If we'd had mandatory screenings from the beginning, you had them now," Harry said. "And they worked." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not interested in what could have been different. I'm here and I'm all right, and the system has been changed. That's what matters." She looked at him with an expression that was, respect, he thought. Not the respect you get from impressing someone, but the respect you get from being seen clearly and found to be exactly what you appeared to be. "Off you go," she said. "Your friends have been haunting this corridor since yesterday." He slid off the bed and picked up his shoes, and she was already returning to her desk with the brisk efficiency he'd come to associate with her particular brand of care, and he walked out of the hospital wing and into the corridor. Ron and Hermione were both there. Ron was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and an empty chocolate frog wrapper beside him, and the expression of someone who has been waiting so long he's made peace with waiting. Hermione was standing with a book open but not reading it, which for Hermione was as clear a sign of preoccupation as anything. They both looked up when he came out. Finally, Ron said, and scrambled to his feet. "Madame Pomfrey is thorough," Harry said. "She kept you an extra day," Hermione said. "We know. We were here." Harry looked at the two of them, Ron with his easy grin, Hermione with her book already being put away, both of them oriented toward him with the uncomplicated directness of people who had decided a long time ago that he was worth being oriented toward, and he thought about what the year had been and what they'd been in it. "Thank you," he said. "For waiting." "Obviously we waited," Ron said, as though this required no explanation. "Shall we go to lunch?" Hermione said. "I believe there's still some of the term left." They walked together down the corridor, and Harry was in the middle between them, which was where he usually ended up and which he thought he'd probably stop noticing by second year. The castle in its last week had a quality of abundance, as though Hogwarts, having held an entire year's worth of everything, was now releasing it all into the warm June air. Students were louder and more present somehow, filling corridors with an energy that was partly relief and partly something more complicated, the reluctance of people who were about to leave somewhere they'd found. Harry moved through it all with the calm he'd had since waking up in the hospital wing, which was a different calm from the one he'd arrived with in September. Less armor, more actual. He had things to do before the end of term. The conversation with Dumbledore had covered the essentials: the stone, Voldemort's dispersal, summer arrangements, the Weasleys' guardianship. But there were other things, smaller things and larger things, that he wanted to close properly. He went to find McGonagall first. She was in her office, which smelled like parchment and the faint lingering trace of her animagus form, something clean and feline. She looked up when he knocked and waved him in and assessed him with the quick, comprehensive look of someone who has been checking the door for this particular student for 4 days. "Potter," she said. "You look considerably better than the last report I had." "I feel considerably better," he said. He sat in the chair across her desk. "I wanted to thank you. For the advocate, for the hearing. For saying what you said in September about your visit to Privet Drive." She folded her hands on the desk. "I don't require thanks for doing what I should have done sooner." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to say it anyway, so I will. Thank you." He paused. "Also, I wanted to talk about next year." She raised an eyebrow. "Quidditch," he said. "I want to continue on the team. But I also want to know what my academic ceiling looks like. I've been working at a first-year level and it's been appropriate for starting out, but I want to know where the actual ceiling is." He met her eyes. "I want to be tested properly." She looked at him for a long moment. "You want advanced placement." "I want to know where I stand," he said. "Not to skip ahead, I don't want to be removed from my year group. I like where I am. But extra work, harder problems. I learn better when things are difficult." McGonagall was quiet for a moment, and then she said something Harry had not expected: "There is an independent study program available to exceptional students from second year onward. Endorsed by the relevant department heads, structured around individually designed curricula." She paused. "I was going to suggest it to you in September of second year. There is no reason we cannot begin the paperwork now." Harry looked at her. "You were already planning it." "I try to anticipate," she said dryly. "So do I," he said. She almost smiled. "Yes," she said. "I've noticed." She picked up her quill. "I'll have the preliminary paperwork ready by Thursday. You'll need endorsements from at least 3 department heads. I suspect that will not be difficult." He stood. "Thank you, Professor." "Quidditch practice begins the second week of September," she said, without looking up from her writing. "I expect you there." "Yes, Professor." He was nearly to the door when she said, still writing, "Potter. Your mother received the same suggestion, from Professor Dumbledore, in her 3rd year. She turned it into something remarkable." A pause. "I mention it only as data." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "That's useful data," he said. "I thought you'd find it so," she said, and kept writing. He went. Snape was the harder visit to calculate. Harry thought about it carefully, not whether to go, because he'd already decided to go, but how. The thing he wanted to say to Snape was not a thing that could be managed through indirection. It was a direct thing requiring a direct approach, and the question was whether Snape would receive it as such or whether he would receive it as an imposition and react accordingly. He decided to go and find out, which was the approach he took with most things. The potions classroom was empty, but the adjacent office was not, light under the door, the particular smell of Snape's workroom, something complex and mineral. Harry knocked. The pause before the door opened was long enough to be a message. Snape looked at him. "Potter," he said. "You're out of the hospital wing. Discharged this morning." Snape stepped back. Harry came in. The office was smaller than McGonagall's and denser, shelves floor to ceiling, jars and vials and the suspended, preserved things of advanced potions work. Snape's desk was covered with marked essays, the comments in the margins precise and generally brutal. Harry didn't sit. Neither did Snape. They stood in the small space and regarded each other with the mutual attention of two people who have been watching each other carefully all year. "Your protection," Harry said. "The potion's riddle. Hermione solved it." "I know," Snape said. She said it was the best designed logic problem she'd encountered in any first-year educational context. A pause. "That is a very specific compliment." "She wanted it passed on exactly," Harry said. "She said the elegance of the constraint parameters was, her words, unusually sophisticated for something designed to stop a first year." He paused. "I think she meant it as the highest compliment available." Snape was looking at him with the flat expression he used when he was managing his own response to something. "Granger is exceptionally gifted," he said finally. "Yes," Harry said. A silence that was not uncomfortable. "I wanted to thank you," Harry said. "For the offer in October. The testimony." He met Snape's eyes. "You didn't have to make that offer. You'd have been within your professional rights to simply submit something formal if called. What you offered was different." "It was practical," Snape said. "It was personal," Harry said. "Not accusing. Just accurate." Snape looked at him. The measuring quality was there, but it was looking at something different than it had looked at in September, something it had taken the full year to resolve into focus. "Your mother," Snape said, and then stopped. He started again, with the manner of someone choosing words with the care of a person who has rehearsed them and is now finding the rehearsal insufficient. "She was the most naturally talented which I have known in 30 years of this work. She was kind in a way that was not simple, not naive. It was chosen, repeatedly, with full awareness of the cost." He paused. "You have that quality." Harry was quiet. "I owe her a debt I cannot repay," Snape said. "I have understood that for many years. What I understand now, which I did not fully understand in September, is that the debt is not to her memory." He looked at Harry directly. "It is to you." Harry thought about this carefully. He thought about what it meant and what he wanted it to mean and whether those were the same thing. He thought about the small collection he was building, fragments of Lily Potter assembled from the people who'd known her. Eyes. Natural talent. Kindness as a choice, not a default. "I don't need you to pay a debt," Harry said. That's not what I want from you." "What do you want?" Snape said, and it was a genuine question, unguarded in a way Harry suspected was unusual. "What you offered me in October," Harry said. "Someone in the room who's watching and would say something if something was wrong." He paused. "Not a friend. Not a mentor. Just, someone who's paying attention with good intent." He looked at Snape. "Can you do that?" Snape was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through his face that had no convenient label, too complicated for a single word, too honest to be performing anything. He said, "Yes." "Good," Harry said. He turned toward the door. "Potter," Snape said. Harry looked back. "Your potion's work this year was adequate," Snape said. "It will need to improve significantly if you intend to continue to any EWT level." Harry almost smiled. "I'll work on it," he said. "See that you do," Snape said, and returned to his essays, and Harry went out into the corridor with something settled that had been unresolved all year. He found Neville in the greenhouse that afternoon. This was not surprising. Neville spent most of his free time in the greenhouses, with Sprout's encouragement and his own evident preference for being around things that grew. He was repotting something when Harry came in, hands deep in soil, entirely focused. Harry sat on an upturned crate and watched him work for a minute. "You're out," Neville said, without looking up. "This morning." "Good." Neville moved the plant to its new pot with careful hands and sat back. He had soil on his forehead and didn't appear to know. He looked at Harry with his round, honest face and said, "You went after the stone." "Yes." "With Ron and Hermione?" "Yes." Neville was quiet for a moment. People are saying, in the common room, that you stopped Voldemort. He said the name without flinching, which Harry noticed. Not you know who. Voldemort. I stopped Quirrell, Harry said. Voldemort was, in Quirrell. Yes. He looked at Neville. You said his name. Neville blinked. Oh. I don't, I mean, everyone acts like saying it is dangerous, but it's just a word, isn't it? It's what we call him. It seems strange to be afraid of a word. He paused. I suppose I've been afraid of other things for long enough that I've run out of room for words. Harry looked at him. He thought about what Neville had told him in the library in November, about his parents in St. Mungo's, and he thought about the particular texture of being shaped by something you couldn't fight when you were a baby and had spent every year since then standing back up. I wanted to tell you something, Harry said. Before the end of term. Neville looked at him. You came through every one of your exams, Harry said. I watched you in Charms, you got every practical right. Not perfectly but right, which is the more important thing. And in herbology you're already past what they're teaching us. He paused. I know your Gran is expecting someone who looks a particular way. I know that's hard to live with. He met Neville's eyes. But I want you to know that from outside that expectation, what I see is someone who is precisely and exactly himself, and that person is remarkable. Neville was very still. You don't have to do anything with that, Harry said. I just wanted to say it before we went our separate ways for the summer. Neville looked at his soil-covered hands for a moment. Then he looked up, and there was something in his face that was very young and very clear and very private. Nobody's said that to me before, he said quietly. Not that version of it. I know, Harry said. That's why I said it. They sat in the greenhouse in the afternoon warmth for a while after that, Neville working, Harry watching the plants, and it was comfortable in the particular way of two people who understand each other without requiring a performance of understanding. The end-of-year feast was the first night of June, and Gryffindor won the House Cup. This happened because Dumbledore, at the moment when Slytherin's lead seemed insurmountable, awarded last-minute points, to Harry, to Ron, to Hermione, to Neville, for their various parts in what he described to the Hall as the protection of the school from a significant threat, with a gravity that made it clear that what he was actually describing was significant without describing it fully. The Hall was very quiet when he spoke and very loud when he finished. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table and watched the banners change from Slytherin green to Gryffindor gold with a feeling that was not triumph but was something adjacent to it, a warmth, a rightness. He was sitting between Ron and Hermione. Neville was 3 seats away and his face was doing something extraordinary, the face of someone who has spent their whole life being told they're not enough and has just been told publicly and formally that they were. Harry watched it and felt something very specific in his chest that he had no word for but that seemed important. Draco Malfoy, at the Slytherin table, was looking at the gold banners with an expression Harry took a moment to read properly. Not just disappointment, something more complicated than that. Something that looked, briefly, like envy for something that wasn't the cup. Harry held that observation and tucked it away. Malfoy was a problem and a project for another year, or several years, but the expression had been interesting. Dumbledore caught Harry's eye from the high table and gave him a small nod that was entirely personal rather than ceremonial, and Harry returned it. After the feast, the common room was the warmth and noise of a celebration that had the added quality of being the last one in this particular configuration. By September, some things would have changed, some people grown, some dynamics shifted. Harry stood near the window with Hermione beside him and Ron already in the middle of a knot of other Gryffindors reenacting something from the feast with his arms wide and a first-year chocolate frog in one hand. "What are you thinking about?" Hermione asked. "Next year," Harry said. "Specifically?" He turned it over. "I want to know more about Voldemort," he said. "Not because I'm afraid of him. But because, this year was reactive. I understood things as they happened. I want to understand more before the next thing comes." He paused. And I want to learn more magic. Properly. Further than the curriculum goes. McGonagall mentioned the independent study program to me as well, Hermione said. Harry looked at her. She was planning it for both of us? Apparently she had us both on a list she'd been building since September, Hermione said. She had a quality about her that was trying not to be pleased and not quite managing it. She said she'd discuss it with us in September. I think she wants a third candidate as well. They both looked across the room at Ron, who was currently directing the reenactment with strategic brilliance and obvious joy. He's not a book learner, Harry said. No, Hermione agreed. But the independent study program isn't only books. She paused. I already asked McGonagall. She said she could tailor the framework. Practical problem solving, strategic application. She said she has in mind something involving Quidditch theory but that I wasn't to tell him yet because she wants to pitch it in September. Harry considered this. McGonagall planning since September. Planning for all three of them, understanding what each of them needed, building a framework that would catch them and push them in the directions they were already going. He thought about the kind of teaching that looked like administration, that looked like paperwork and programs and formal arrangements, and was actually something else entirely. Attention, sustained and specific, over time. She's been paying attention all year, he said. They all have, Hermione said. More than we knew. Harry looked at the common room, at the gold and red walls, the fire, the people he'd known for 9 months who had become something permanent without his noticing the exact moment it happened. He thought about how things accumulated. How people accumulated, quietly, one reliable exchange at a time, until suddenly you had a world. He had not had a world in September. He had one now. The morning of the last day arrived with Scotland's particular indifference to occasion, grey skies and the smell of rain coming, the mountains doing their dramatic thing above a lake that reflected clouds. Harry came down to breakfast early and ate at a nearly empty table and watched the hall fill up around him with the unhurried attention of someone who is taking a last look at something before putting it away for the summer. He had his trunk packed. Hedwig had been sent ahead to the Burrow. Arthur was meeting them at King's Cross. He was not apprehensive about the summer. This was worth noting because September Harry had been apprehensive about everything in the peripheral, constant way of someone managing a threat that could come from any direction. June Harry felt the summer ahead as space. Warm, specific, known space. The Burrow with its impossible architectural logic. Molly's kitchen. Fred and George's perpetual projects. Ron at the chessboard, going easy on him and pretending not to be. He was going to spend the summer reading and flying and learning to be in a house where someone looked at the door when he came home. He was going to come back in September with more. Dumbledore came into the hall at 8:30, which was unusual. Dumbledore was typically already at the high table or arriving with the full staff, not coming through the main entrance with the energy of someone who has come specifically. He moved directly to the Gryffindor table and directly to Harry, which caused the ambient noise of the hall to drop in the way ambient noise drops when something is happening. "Good morning, Harry," he said. "I wondered if I might have a brief word before the express." "Of course," Harry said. He stood and they walked to the small antechamber off the hall, which McGonagall used for private conversations and which had the quality of a room designed for exactly this kind of thing. Dumbledore sat down. He did the same thing he'd done on the very first day in the hospital wing, sat down, not to diminish his authority but because standing felt wrong, or because what he was going to say required a posture of honesty rather than formality. Harry sat across from him. "I owe you several things," Dumbledore said. "Some of which I've given you this year. Some of which are longer-term debts." He looked at Harry steadily. "I want to talk to you about what comes next. Not this summer. Further than that." "All right," Harry said. "Voldemort is not gone," Dumbledore said. "I told you this in the hospital wing and I want to be clear about it here, while you are fully well and fully present. He will return. I believe this with some certainty. And when he returns, you will be central to what that means. Not because of anything you've chosen, but because of the nature of what happened in 1981. I know, Harry said. What I want to say to you, Dumbledore said, is that the way I have handled that reality until this year has been insufficient. I managed your safety rather than your preparation. I prioritized a protection strategy over a development strategy. He paused. That changes, if you'll allow it. What does that look like? Harry said. It looks like information given rather than withheld, Dumbledore said. It looks like preparation done with you rather than for you. It looks like treating you as the central intelligence in a situation that concerns you rather than a variable to be managed. He held Harry's gaze. It looks like Albus Dumbledore behaving less like a chess player and more like an ally. Harry looked at him. He thought about the chess board in the third-floor corridor, Quirrell's protection and Ron's clean systematic dismantling of it, the pieces giving way to a mind that respected them enough to play properly. He thought about the difference between being a piece and playing. That's what I want, Harry said. Yes. Then that is what you'll have, Dumbledore said. As best I can manage. You are already more capable than I anticipated at the start of September, and you will be more capable still by the time you're 16, and whatever is coming, whatever form it takes, I intend for you to face it with everything you need. Not what I decide you need. What you actually need. He paused. You'll have to tell me when those things are different. I will, Harry said. I'm quite good at that. You are, Dumbledore said, with something that was warm and rueful and entirely genuine. You absolutely are. He stood and Harry stood, and they shook hands in the antechamber with the formal seriousness of two people entering an agreement, which was what they were doing, and Harry thought it was the strangest thing about his year that it ended here, in a handshake with Albus Dumbledore in a small room off the Great Hall, having negotiated the terms of an alliance as though he were something other than 11 years old. He was something other than 11 years old, in the ways that mattered. He was also 11 years old, in the ways that mattered. Both of these things were true, and neither of them cancelled the other. The Hogwarts Express left at 11. The platform was the particular organized chaos of a school releasing all its energy at once, trunks and owls and the general collisions of a few hundred students trying to find their carriages. Harry stood on platform 9 3/4 with Ron and Hermione and Neville, who had been attached to their group for the last 48 hours with the comfortable ease of someone who has stopped wondering if he belongs somewhere and has simply started being there. Hermione was going home to her parents. She had already written them 3 letters about the year and had told Harry, with the directness she used for important things, that she'd also told them about the hearing, not all of it, but enough. Her mother had sent a card to Pomfrey. Harry had found this out by accident and had felt something he'd had to put down immediately and pick back up more carefully, which was the process he was getting better at. Neville's Gran was on the platform, upright and formidable in a large hat, and when Neville saw her he straightened up in the automatic way of someone responding to an expectation. Harry walked over with him, which Neville hadn't asked for but didn't object to, and said good morning to Augusta Longbottom with the direct politeness he'd found worked better with formidable people than deference. She looked at him with the look of a woman who had assessed a great many people in her life and had firm opinions about all of them. "You're Potter," she said. "Yes," he said. "You went after Voldemort," she said. "At 11. He came after something I was protecting," Harry said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Neville, who was waiting with the particular stillness of someone who does not know what verdict is coming. Augusta Longbottom looked at her grandson with something that shifted, very briefly, very privately, before she composed it back into her usual precision. "Neville," she said. "I understand you were part of what happened in the last week of term." Yes, Gran. Some of it. The headmaster wrote to me," she said. "He described your role as crucial." She said the word as though tasting it. "He said that without your contribution at a particular juncture, events might have gone differently." She straightened. He was referring, I believe, to some kind of chess situation. That was Ron, Neville said quickly. He mentioned Weasley also. He mentioned you for something else. She looked at Neville directly. He said you showed a particular quality of courage. The kind that is often mistaken for its absence. Neville stared at her. I am proud of you, she said, with the manner of someone making a formal declaration rather than a casual one, but meaning it entirely. Your parents would be proud of you. Something happened in Neville's face that Harry turned slightly away from because it was private and enormous and deserved to happen without an audience. Harry looked at the steam and the crowd and the large red engine and thought about James Potter being one of the best chasers McGonagall had ever seen, and Lily Potter's eyes that Petunia couldn't stop seeing, and the way dead parents existed in fragments offered by living people and how you built someone out of fragments if you paid close enough attention. He turned back when Neville's gran had moved on and Neville was standing with his face reassembled but his eyes bright. All right? Harry said. Yes, Neville said, with total honesty. Yes, I'm all right. They found a compartment near the middle of the train and settled in the familiar way of a group that has spent enough time together to have developed its particular spatial arrangement, Ron at the window, Hermione with a book already open, Harry across from them with Neville beside him, the general comfort of people who don't need to be performing anything for each other. The train moved and the platform disappeared and Scotland unrolled outside the windows in its green and grey abundance, and the compartment filled with the kind of conversation that travels in all directions at once, Quidditch and classes and Fred and George's various plans for next year that Ron described with the mix of apprehension and admiration he always used for his brothers. Hermione said she was going to read every second-year text before September, which surprised no one. Neville said his gran was going to make him practice charms every day of the summer, which he seemed less bothered by than Harry would have expected. Harry watched the countryside move past and listened to his friends talk and ate approximately 4 chocolate frogs because the trolley came by and he wanted them and there was no arithmetic required. He thought about the year. He thought about it the way you think about something on the far side of a significant transition, not reliving it, but taking its measure. September to June. 64 healing charms to a hospital wing discharge with a clean diagnostic. A cupboard under the stairs to a bed in the Gryffindor dormitory. Petunia's kitchen to Molly Weasley's. One person who knew his name to a short list of people he trusted with the complete version of himself. He thought about Voldemort, dispersed and diminished somewhere, waiting. He thought about whatever was coming, whatever second year or fifth year or seventh year held, the shape of it not yet visible, the difficulty of it not yet known. He thought about Dumbledore's handshake and McGonagall's program and Snape's yes. He thought about Arthur's letter and the green jumper with the H on it and Molly's soup. He thought about Lily Potter's eyes and the fact that a woman who loved her sister and hated what she represented had, at the end of a long hearing in a stone room, cried, just briefly, just once, and that he had heard it, and that he had meant what he'd said about her sister, that he thought she had loved her somewhere under everything else. And that was the most complicated thing about the whole year and also the most necessary thing to understand, that people could contain both the love and the damage simultaneously and that forgiving one didn't require pretending the other wasn't real. He thought about what he'd said to Pomfrey this morning. Actually good. He ran it past himself again, honest, the way he was honest with himself about everything. Yes. That was true. Genuinely true, not managed. Good in the actual sense. Present in the actual sense. Forward-facing in the actual sense. He was going to the Burrow for the summer. He was coming back in September. He was going to learn more, prepare more, be ready for more, not because he was afraid of what was coming but because he was exactly the kind of person who wanted to be ready, who found preparation satisfying, who liked understanding the room before entering it. He was going to do all of this and also fly and eat when he was hungry and read past midnight because the book was interesting and sit in the greenhouse with Neville and argue about Quidditch with Ron and do research with Hermione with matching notebooks in the back corner of a library. He was going to live in the actual sense. That was the thing that had changed. That was the thing that 64 healing charms made visible and a mandatory scan brought into the light, and a year at Hogwarts had shifted into being true. He had survived for a decade, and survival had been the whole project, the daily work, the everything. Now survival was the baseline, and above the baseline was the rest of it, the wanting and the having and the being present in the warm ordinary middle of a life that was, in the most fundamental and non-negotiable sense, his. Outside the window, Scotland gave way to England. The light was different, lower, the sky wider. Ron said something about food and reached for the last of the birdie bots. Hermione turned a page. Neville was half asleep in his corner with the contentment of someone who has had a verdict he'd been waiting for and can rest. The train moved through the afternoon with the certainty of something that knows where it's going. Harry Potter sat in the middle of all of it and let it be good, completely and without reservation. Let it be the best version of ordinary, let it be, in the truest sense, enough. Because it was. Because he had learned, over the course of one impossible year, that he was allowed to have things. That wanting them wasn't weakness and taking them wasn't theft. That the small, careful, managing version of himself that had kept him functional for 10 years could relax now, not disappear, never fully disappear. It was part of him, it had made him quick and perceptive and difficult to frighten, but relax, settle back, let something else come forward. The something else that came forward was 11 years old and had green eyes and a scar and 2 friends across from him eating chocolate, and it looked out the window at England arriving in the afternoon light and thought, next year. Not with dread. With interest. The train ran south. The compartment breathed. The year was over, and what it had built was not over, would not be over, would compound and accumulate and become the foundation of what came next, of second year and every year after, of the long complicated fight that was coming and the person who would stand in the middle of it, clear-eyed and prepared and not afraid. That person was Harry Potter. He had survived 64 healing charms and everything they documented. He was just getting started.